I am Zoe, 30 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful forensic accountant, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Independence Day, they invited me to the annual family barbecue to keep up appearances. Between the catered ribs and expensive champagne, my grandmother handed me a check for $7 million. My stepmom, Beatrice, snatched her own check, leaned forward, and smirked. "You know this is worthless, right?" she said. "She closed that account years ago. Her brain is gone." My stepsister ripped hers in half. I simply folded my check, slid it into my bag, and smiled. The next morning, I walked into the private wealth bank and deposited it, triggering a hidden clause that would take everything from them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in an affluent neighborhood in Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling brick colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our six-bedroom estate, with its perfectly manicured lawn and custom outdoor kitchen, was a fortress of fake perfection I could never quite belong to. My childhood was abruptly redefined the moment my mother passed away, and my father David quickly moved Beatrice into the master bedroom. Beatrice brought along her daughter Chloe, and instantly I became the outsider in my own home. My father was the owner of a highly profitable custom lumber business, but at home he was a coward who let Beatrice dictate every single dynamic. He bought her peace by sacrificing mine. Fast forward to the present. The July 4th cookout was less of a family gathering and more of a networking event for Beatrice to show off her supposed wealth to the church committee in the neighborhood. I arrived late, purposely avoiding the initial rush of fake hugs and air kisses. The backyard looked like a film set. Beatrice had rented enormous white canvas tents, hired a full catering staff, and practically forced everyone to adhere to a strict designer dress code. Beatrice walked up to me, immediately looking me up and down with obvious disdain. I wore a simple linen sundress, and my natural curls pulled back, a stark contrast to her heavy makeup and stiff gown that looked ridiculous for a backyard cookout. "I see you decided not to follow the dress code," she said loudly. "But I suppose we cannot expect you to understand presentation. You always were the stubborn one." I ignored her jab and kept my focus on scanning the crowd. I spotted Chloe, now 28, busy in the corner of the limestone patio, holding her phone up on a portable ring light. She called herself a lifestyle coach on Instagram, but her entire existence was funded by my father's bank accounts. Her husband DeAndre, a self-proclaimed real estate investor who had never actually flipped a single property, was loudly bragging near the grill. He was the epitome of fake wealth. His leased matte black SUV was parked diagonally across two spots in the driveway, practically demanding attention from anyone walking past the gate. He was wearing a designer silk shirt, completely unbuttoned, sporting a massive gold chain that I knew for a fact turned his neck green when he sweat. He stood holding an unlit cigar as a prop while he talked over everyone else about his imaginary commercial developments. I knew the truth. His portfolio consisted of maxed-out credit cards in my father's name. The only reason I attended was sitting quietly in the shade of the grand oak tree. Grandma Loretta. She was 78 years old, confined to a padded wheelchair and wrapped in a light cashmere shawl, despite the stifling summer heat. Beatrice had spent the last 2 years convincing everyone in our social circle that Loretta was suffering from severe dementia. It was the perfect excuse to force my grandmother into a high-end nursing facility so Beatrice could assume power of attorney and take over the family estate without interference. I walked over to Grandma, kneeling gently beside her chair to eye level. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd with a quiet intensity, not foggy like Beatrice always claimed. I squeezed her fragile hand. The music was blasting, some upbeat rhythm and blues track, when Beatrice clinked her champagne glass with a silver serving spoon, demanding the attention of the 50 guests scattered across the lawn. She wanted to make a toast about family unity and the blessings of generational wealth. It was entirely sickening. But before Beatrice could launch into her meticulously rehearsed speech, Grandma Loretta raised a trembling hand. "I have gifts," Loretta announced. Her voice was raspy but carried surprisingly well over the sudden quiet of the crowd. Beatrice sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes at her church friends standing nearby. "Oh, Mama Loretta, we do not need gifts today. Just rest your mind. You are confused again." But Loretta ignored her. She reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan and pulled out 3 folded pieces of heavy parchment paper. She handed the first one to Beatrice, the second to Chloe, and the third directly to me. I opened the paper. It was a formal cashier's check. The amount written out in crisp black ink was exactly $7 million. The signature was firm and clear. Loretta Washington. Beatrice looked down at her check and burst into a loud theatrical laugh. She held it up high for the guests nearby to see, shaking her head. "Oh, bless her heart. Look at this, everyone. A check for $7 million. Mama Loretta, you are just too sweet." Her tone was dripping with heavy condescension. She then leaned down her face, inches from Loretta's ear, and spoke loudly so the whole patio could hear. "Mama, we closed this checking account right before we put you in the facility. Remember, there is no money here. This is just a worthless piece of paper from a dead account." Chloe walked over, glancing at her own check. She scoffed, looking directly at her phone camera to make sure her followers were catching the live drama. "Seriously, I thought she was actually giving us something useful. What an absolute joke." Without a second thought, Chloe violently ripped the $7 million check in half, then tore those halves into quarters. She marched over to the buffet table and dropped the torn pieces right into a silver platter of sticky barbecue ribs. "Trash goes in the trash," she muttered, wiping her hands in disgust. DeAndre laughed his booming, obnoxious laugh. He walked up behind me, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Hey, Zoe, maybe you can use that to pay off your student loans. Or better yet, use it as toilet paper. It is worth about the same in the real world. Why do you even humor the old bat?" My father stood by the grill the entire time, flipping burgers, with an intense, forced focus, cowardly looking away from the confrontation. He saw his wife humiliate his mother. He saw his stepdaughter destroy the gift. He saw his son-in-law mock me, and he did not say a single word to defend his own blood. I did not cry. I did not yell. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to look past the surface and read the data. I looked closely at the check in my hand. I recognized the 9-digit routing number printed at the bottom. It was not from the local credit union account Beatrice had legally closed. It was a specific numerical sequence used for private offshore routing. I had seen that exact formatting only a handful of times in my career when dealing with ultra-high net worth corporate audits. I calmly pulled a linen napkin from the table, wiped a small smudge of barbecue sauce off the edge of my check, and folded it perfectly into thirds. I unzipped my designer tote bag, a bag I bought with my own hard-earned salary, and slipped the check securely inside the interior pocket. I leaned down to Grandma Loretta. The crowd had already gone back to their drinks, dismissing the old woman's crazy stunt as just another symptom of her failing mind. I leaned in and whispered in her ear, "I will deposit it tomorrow morning, Grandma." Loretta did not say a word out loud, but she turned her head slightly and gave me a sharp, lucid wink. It was the deliberate look of a brilliant woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She was laying a trap, and Beatrice and Chloe had just walked right into it. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and turned toward the driveway. Beatrice called out after me from across the patio, "Leaving so soon, Zoe? You have not even had any of the catering. You always ruin the family vibe." My father finally put down his grilling tongs and jogged over to me as I reached my car door. He looked around nervously, making sure Beatrice could not hear him. "Zoe, please do not make a scene," he whispered, looking at the ground instead of my eyes. "Your stepmother worked very hard on this party. Just throw that piece of paper away and come back inside. Have a plate. You know how Beatrice gets when she feels disrespected in front of the church elders." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. "You mean the church elders she is trying to buy votes from?" I replied coldly. "She just humiliated your mother in front of half the neighborhood, and you are worried about her party aesthetic." He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he developed over the years of bowing to his wife. She is just confused, Zoe. Beatrice is doing her best to manage the estate. Just let it go. We are family. Blood does not make us family. David, I said, deliberately refusing to call him Dad. Respect does. And there is none left here. I got into my car and locked the doors, watching him shuffle back to his wife like an obedient dog. I did not look back. I simply pulled out of the driveway, leaving their fortress of fake wealth behind. I knew exactly what I held in my bag. The next morning, exactly at 9 o'clock, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the most exclusive private wealth management bank in the city center. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked straight up to the premier client desk. The marble floors echoed under my heels. I slid the folded check across the polished mahogany counter to the teller. She smiled politely, picked it up, and began typing the routing number into her secure system. A second later, her hands froze, hovering over the keyboard. The polite smile vanished. The color completely drained from her face. She looked up at me, then looked back at her screen, her eyes wide with shock. "Miss Washington," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "This routing number. It is flagged. I cannot process this at my station. I need to bring the branch manager out here immediately. Please do not move." I stood completely still at the premier client desk. The young teller quickly locked her computer screen and hurried toward a frosted glass door behind the counter. My mind immediately went to work. As a forensic accountant, I know that banks do not panic over forged checks. They simply reject them and mail you a standard notice. Panic only happens when the numbers on the screen are too large for a standard employee to authorize, or when an account has a high security lock that requires executive clearance. 5 minutes passed. The polished mahogany counter felt cold under my fingertips. Finally, the heavy glass door clicked open. A tall man in a tailored charcoal suit walked out, his expression intensely serious. He was the senior branch manager, someone I recognized from annual corporate banking galas. He bypassed the teller station entirely and approached me with a measured and highly respectful stride. "Miss Washington," he said, keeping his voice deliberately low to prevent any sound from carrying across the marble lobby. "My name is Richard Harrison. I have been expecting you, though I did not know exactly when you would arrive. Please come with me." He led me away from the public floor and down a quiet, carpeted hallway lined with abstract art. We entered a private VIP boardroom. The room was soundproof, smelling faintly of expensive leather and fresh espresso. Richard motioned for me to sit at the sprawling conference table before taking the seat opposite mine. He placed my grandmother's check perfectly in the center of the table between us. He then pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "First, I need to verify your identity," he said, sliding a biometric fingerprint scanner across the wood. I placed my thumb on the glowing green pad, and a second later his tablet chimed with confirmation. Richard exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding. "Your stepmother Beatrice came into this branch 13 months ago with forged medical documents, claiming your grandmother was unfit to manage her finances. She legally closed Loretta's local checking and savings accounts. Beatrice thought she had seized every dime your grandmother owned." I nodded, remembering the smug look on Beatrice's face the day she showed up at my apartment to brag about her new financial control. "I know," I replied. "That is exactly what Beatrice yelled at the barbecue yesterday. She claimed this check was drawn from a dead account." Richard smiled, a sharp and knowing smile. "Beatrice was right about the local accounts being closed," he said, "but she was entirely wrong about the routing number on this check." He turned the check around so it faced me, pointing a silver pen at the sequence of numbers at the bottom. "As a financial professional, you likely noticed this is not a domestic routing code. You are looking at the direct access code to a secretive offshore blind trust located in Zurich. Your late grandfather, Elias Washington, established this trust 4 decades ago. Elias was a brilliant man who fought his way up from the segregated South. He dealt with redlining and corrupt bankers his entire early career, which made him deeply distrust the American banking system. He wanted an impenetrable safety net for his true bloodline, untouched by domestic courts or greedy relatives. When Elias passed away, control of the trust transferred entirely to your grandmother Loretta. She has maintained it in complete secrecy, never touching the principal, allowing the investments to compound year after year. Beatrice never knew it existed. Your father David never knew it existed. The only person who had the access codes was Loretta. I felt my heart rate steady. My grandfather Elias had started the family lumber business from absolute nothing. He was a man who wore steel-toed boots and worked until his hands bled to build a foundation for his family. He always warned me that wealth attracts parasites. "How much is in the trust, Richard?" I asked quietly. Richard opened the leather portfolio and slid a single sheet of watermarked paper toward me. The liquid assets currently sit at exactly $21 million, not tied up in real estate, not locked in depreciating assets. Pure, untouchable, liquid cash. The number hung in the heavy air of the boardroom. $21 million. Beatrice had been parading around the country club flaunting leased cars and taking out high-interest loans to maintain her bougie image, completely unaware that true massive generational wealth was sitting quietly in an offshore account. "But that is not why I brought you back here," Richard continued. He turned to the next page in the portfolio, revealing a dense legal contract filled with tight paragraphs of legalese. This trust was designed with a very specific and ironclad trigger clause. "Your grandmother visited me privately 3 months ago. She knew Beatrice was circling like a vulture waiting for her to die. She also knew your stepsister Chloe and her husband DeAndre were bleeding your father dry to fund their fake lifestyle. Loretta wanted to protect the legacy, but she needed to know who was actually worthy of it. So she designed a morality test." I listened intently, my professional curiosity peaking alongside my personal shock. "The test was brilliantly simple," Richard explained. "Loretta ordered 3 identical cashier's checks drawn against the trust, each made out for $7 million. She planned to hand them to you, Beatrice and Chloe. The legal stipulations attached to these checks were ruthless. If a recipient refused the check, mocked it, or destroyed it, they triggered a forfeiture clause. By rejecting the physical instrument of the trust, they legally renounced any and all future claims to the Washington family estate." Richard leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Tell me, Zoe, what happened at the barbecue yesterday?" I smiled, the image of Chloe's disgusted face flashing in my mind. "Beatrice publicly refused hers and mocked my grandmother's mental state," I said. "Chloe physically tore her check into pieces and threw it in a plate of barbecue ribs." Richard let out a low chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "By doing so, they have officially disinherited themselves. The trap was sprung the moment they showed their true colors and disrespected their elder. But you kept yours. By bringing this check into the bank and initiating the deposit, you have satisfied the final condition of your grandmother's mandate." He pushed a heavy gold pen across the mahogany table. "If you sign this document, the $7 million will immediately clear into your personal accounts. However, because the other 2 beneficiaries failed the test, their portions do not simply vanish into thin air. They revert. And according to the updated bylaws, Loretta filed, the person who passes the test does not just receive their initial share. They become the sole executor and total beneficiary of the entire blind trust. If you sign right now, Zoe, you take absolute control of the full $21 million. Furthermore, the trust holds the primary mortgage notes on several of your father's business assets. You will effectively hold the keys to the entire Washington empire. Beatrice will have absolutely no legal standing to challenge you. She forfeited her rights the moment she called the check worthless." I stared at the gold pen. For years I had watched my father shrink himself to appease Beatrice's endless demands. I had watched Chloe parade around in designer clothes bought with money my grandfather broke his back to earn. I had endured the snide comments, the exclusion, the blatant disrespect, all while building my own career from the ground up without a single dime of their help. They thought they had won. They thought putting Grandma Loretta in a nursing facility was their final victory. They had no idea they had just handed me the weapon that would dismantle their entire fake reality. I picked up the pen. The metal was heavy and cool to the touch. I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed my name on the solid black line at the bottom of the page, my signature sharp and deliberate. "It is done," Richard said, carefully closing the leather portfolio and locking it inside a secure drawer. "The funds will be fully accessible within 24 hours. Welcome to the board, Miss Washington." I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored skirt. A deep, unfamiliar sense of absolute power settled into my bones. For the first time in my life, I was not the victim of my family's toxic dynamics. I was the architect of their downfall. I thanked. Richard shook his hand firmly and walked out of the VIP room. As I stepped back onto the bustling floor of the bank lobby, the heavy glass doors sliding open to let in the bright morning sun, my phone buzzed violently in my purse. I pulled it out expecting an email from my accounting firm. Instead, the screen lit up with a long text message from my father. It was a massive block of text devoid of any emotional warmth, written with the cold detachment of a shady business transaction. Zoe, the message read, "I know you are upset about how things went yesterday, but we need to make some immediate changes. DeAndre has a massive commercial real estate flip lined up, and the bank needs more collateral to secure his loan. I am transferring your 15% equity in the family lumber business over to DeAndre's holding company today. You have a good corporate job, so you do not really need the equity anyway. Beatrice agrees this is what is best for the family's future. We will send the transfer paperwork to your office this afternoon. Do not make this difficult." I stopped walking right there on the sidewalk. I stared at the bright screen of my phone, reading the pathetic words again to ensure I was not hallucinating. My own father was cowardly, stripping away the business equity I had earned through 80-hour work weeks. He was literally stealing from his own flesh and blood to hand it over to a fraudulent son-in-law who leased his entire lifestyle, all just to keep his manipulative wife happy. They were trying to erase my hard work completely to fund their delusions of grandeur. I locked my phone screen and slipped it back into my designer bag. A slow, highly dangerous smile crept across my face. They wanted to play a game of financial leverage with a forensic accountant who just inherited $21 million and secretly held the mortgage to their entire lives. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. I marched straight to my car, gripping the steering wheel, as I merged onto the highway toward Washington Custom Lumber. My grandfather Elias had built the corporate headquarters on the industrial edge of the city. It was originally a sprawling, practical complex that smelled of fresh pine sawdust, diesel fuel, and hard work. But by the time my father inherited the company, he had completely gutted the executive suites to make them look like a trendy tech startup. He installed floor-to-ceiling glass walls, imported Italian marble floors, and hung incredibly expensive, meaningless abstract art. It was all a grand, hollow facade, just like him. I pushed through the heavy double glass doors of the executive floor, entirely ignoring the frantic receptionist who scrambled to pick up her phone and announce my arrival. I did not slow my pace. I swung the massive oak door to the CEO suite wide open without knocking. My father was sitting behind his oversized mahogany desk, looking exactly like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. Beatrice was standing right beside him, hovering over his shoulder, like a vulture guarding a fresh kill. She had one perfectly manicured hand resting possessively on the back of his high leather chair. A thick stack of legal documents sat perfectly aligned on the center of the desk blotter, next to a gold-plated pen. "You could not even wait an hour," I said, my voice cold and echoing slightly in the massive office. "You sent me a cowardly text message trying to steal my equity while I was literally standing in the lobby of the bank." David swallowed hard, nervously adjusting the knot of his expensive silk tie. His eyes darted toward the open door before looking back at me. "Zoe, please close the door and lower your voice. We can handle this situation like professionals." "Professionals?" I laughed, stepping deeper into the room and letting the heavy oak door click shut behind me. "You want to talk about professionalism right now, David? Let us talk about 5 years ago. Let us talk about when this company was drowning in $2 million of toxic debt because you tried to impress your country club friends with 3 terrible expansion deals. Who did you call when the creditors threatened to seize the equipment? You did not call Beatrice. You called me. I worked 80-hour weeks. I sat in a cramped, unair-conditioned filing room, auditing 10 years of your messy, disorganized ledgers. I personally negotiated with the suppliers to stop them from liquidating this exact building. I saved this family business from absolute bankruptcy while your precious stepdaughter Chloe was taking private jets to Miami on your corporate credit card. I earned that 15% equity with my own blood and sweat. Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down with absolute disdain. She hated when I brought up the past simply because it highlighted her own uselessness and financial illiteracy. You are being dramatic as usual, Zoe, she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. You did a little accounting work for your father. That is your actual job. He compensated you with a nice executive title at the time. You should be grateful he gave you an opportunity. But the fact remains, this is a family business. And right now, the family desperately needs that equity consolidated. DeAndre is putting together a massive commercial real estate acquisition. He needs those shares placed under his holding company to show the bank he has the collateral to secure a $5 million commercial loan. I stared at her, completely unfazed by her aggressive tone or her expensive designer suit. You are taking the equity I bled for to use as collateral for a fraud who has never successfully closed a single commercial property deal in his life. DeAndre leases his cars, he leases his watches, and now you are letting him lease my grandfather's legacy. Beatrice slammed her hand flat on the desk, her heavy diamond rings clicking sharply against the polished wood. Blood is blood, Zoe, she snapped, dropping all pretense of church-going civility. You may have the Washington last name, but you are not part of this family's future. You are just a relic from David's first marriage. My daughter and my son-in-law are building a legacy for the next generation. Your father agrees that keeping the business assets consolidated under DeAndre is the smartest move for our generational wealth. Now sign the transfer papers and go back to your little cubicle before you embarrass yourself further. I shifted my gaze away from her and looked directly at my father. He refused to meet my eyes, choosing instead to stare intensely at a bronze paperweight sitting on the corner of his desk. Is that right, David? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. You are giving my share of the company to a man who lies for a living. You are choosing your new wife's image over your own daughter's security. Again. He finally looked up, his expression, a pathetic mix of guilt, cowardice, and extreme exhaustion. It is just business, Zoe, he pleaded softly. DeAndre really needs the leverage for the bank underwriters. If he does not get this loan, Chloe is going to lose the house they just put an offer on. I will make it up to you later. I promise I will write you a personal check when the business has more liquid cash. Just sign the papers so we can finalize the loan application this afternoon and keep the peace in the house. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Beatrice crossed her arms over her chest, a smug, victorious smile spreading across her face. She thought she had me completely cornered. She thought my silence was the sound of surrender. She thought I was still the same broken teenager who used to sit in her bedroom begging for a scrap of validation from a father who was always too weak to protect her. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a senior forensic accountant who had just inherited $21 million in liquid cash, and I knew exactly how commercial banking regulations worked. My mind calculated the variables in a fraction of a second. By demanding my equity, they were attaching the family business directly to DeAndre's fraudulent loan application. If I fought them and kept my shares, I would remain a minority shareholder tied to a sinking ship when the federal government inevitably audited him. If I signed the papers today, I was legally severing myself from the massive financial crater DeAndre was about to create. They thought they were stealing my hard-earned equity. In reality, they were legally volunteering to take the full devastating impact of an impending federal felony. I let out a slow, steady breath. I reached into my designer bag, pulled out my own heavy fountain pen, and stepped right up to the edge of the mahogany desk. Without saying another word, I flipped past the dense legal jargon directly to the final signature page of the transfer agreement. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I did not ask for a single concession. I calmly and precisely signed my name on the dotted line, officially relinquishing my 15% stake in Washington Custom Lumber, transferring it entirely to DeAndre's shell company. I capped my pen, slid it back into my bag, and pushed the thick stack of papers back across the desk toward Beatrice. "It is all yours," I said quietly. Beatrice looked visibly shocked by my sudden and complete compliance, but her surprise quickly morphed into extreme blinding arrogance. She snatched the paperwork off the desk, holding it to her chest like a hard-won trophy. "See, David?" She gloated, looking down at my father with a sickeningly sweet smile. "I told you she would eventually see reason and do what is right for the family. Thank you for your cooperation, Zoe. You can show yourself out now." I turned my back on them and walked out of the executive suite without a second glance. The air felt incredibly light in my lungs. As I rode the glass elevator down to the lobby, I watched the sprawling lumberyard shrink below me. I was officially free of David's endless liabilities. I stepped out of the building and walked to my car, the bright afternoon sun warming my face. As soon as I was secure inside my vehicle with the doors locked and the engine running, I pulled my phone from my purse. I bypassed my personal contacts entirely and opened my encrypted professional directory. I scrolled down to a highly restricted number I had acquired during a massive corporate audit 2 years ago. It was a direct line to a senior investigator at the Internal Revenue Service who specialized exclusively in commercial loan fraud and shell company operations. I pressed call and put the phone to my ear. It rang twice before a deep, gruff, and highly professional voice answered. "Investigator Reynolds speaking." "Hello, Investigator Reynolds," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "My name is Zoe Washington. I am a forensic auditor at the downtown firm. I would like to submit an anonymous tip with immediate, actionable evidence regarding fraudulent valuations on a pending commercial loan application." Reynolds' tone instantly sharpened the background noise of his office fading away. "I am listening closely, Miss Washington. What exactly are we looking at?" "The primary applicant is DeAndre Vance," I replied, rattling off the details with clinical precision. "He is submitting an application this afternoon for a $5 million commercial real estate loan. He is using newly acquired 15% equity in Washington Custom Lumber as his primary collateral. I have first-hand documented knowledge that the holding company he is using is a complete shell. His previous tax returns have been artificially inflated, and the financial statements he is providing to the bank today have been completely fabricated to secure federal funds." I heard Reynolds typing rapidly on a mechanical keyboard in the background. "If you have the paper trail to back this up, Miss Washington, this is a textbook wire fraud and bank fraud case. It carries serious mandatory minimums. Can you provide the documentation?" I smiled, staring up through my windshield at the tinted glass windows of the CEO's suite, where Beatrice and my father were likely popping an expensive bottle of champagne to celebrate their victory over me. "I can provide the exact routing numbers, the shell company registration documents, and the historical ledgers to prove the equity valuation he claimed is massively falsified," I said. "I will send the encrypted file directly to your secure server within the hour. Tell your federal underwriting team to flag his loan application the absolute second it hits their department." "Understood," Reynolds said, his voice grim and determined. "We will freeze the application and open a preliminary criminal investigation immediately. Thank you for the tip. We take this kind of fraud very seriously." I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. Beatrice thought blood was blood. She thought she had successfully stripped me of my grandfather's legacy to fund her fake lifestyle. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed her precious, untouchable son-in-law a one-way ticket to a federal indictment. I shifted my car into drive and pulled out of the industrial park, heading back toward the city center. The trap was set, the bait was swallowed whole, and now all I had to do was wait for Sunday morning church service to let their entire house of cards come crashing down in front of everyone they were trying so desperately to impress. Sunday morning arrived with the heavy, suffocating humidity that was incredibly typical of late summer in the South. I pulled my car into the sprawling, freshly paved parking lot of Greater Zion Fellowship. This massive building was not just a simple place of worship. It was the absolute epicenter of elite African American society in the entire metropolitan city. The massive parking lot looked exactly like a luxury car dealership, packed door to door with highly customized Range Rovers, sleek black Mercedes sedans, and polished Lexuses. If you wanted to do highly lucrative business, secure a powerful political endorsement launch, a new luxury brand, or aggressively climb the ruthless social ladder, you absolutely had to be seen sitting in the plush pews at Greater Zion on a Sunday morning. And today, my stepmother Beatrice was making absolutely certain that she was the undeniable center of the universe. She was aggressively and loudly campaigning for the highly coveted, incredibly powerful position of president of the church trustee board. I walked through the towering heavy glass doors and stepped into the massive cavernous sanctuary. The intense freezing air conditioning hit my face immediately, providing a welcome relief from the blistering heat outside. I took a quiet seat near the middle aisle, perfectly blending into the massive crowd. The sprawling room was a spectacular, overwhelming display of massive wealth, fragile ego, and expensive Sunday best attire. The massive choir was currently singing a vibrant, soaring gospel anthem, their powerful voices perfectly amplified by the state-of-the-art multi-million-dollar sound system, but my eyes were firmly locked on the front row. Beatrice was proudly holding court. She wore a tailored, excessively bright yellow designer suit and an absurdly large matching hat, adorned with stiff, ridiculous feathers that practically required its own separate zip code. She was dripping in sparkling diamond tennis bracelets and a heavy, ostentatious diamond necklace that blindingly caught the theatrical stage lights every single time she moved her neck. She was aggressively hugging elderly board members, enthusiastically shaking hands with prominent city council members, and flashing her perfectly bleached veneered teeth for anyone pointing a smartphone camera in her direction. My father sat directly next to her, looking incredibly exhausted and hollow, but he was wearing a custom-tailored, highly expensive gray suit simply to play the required part of the supportive, wealthy patriarch. Chloe and DeAndre were sitting comfortably right beside them. DeAndre was wearing a ridiculous maroon velvet blazer with a black silk pocket square, looking significantly more like a background extra in an urban music video than a serious man attending a morning Sunday service. He kept aggressively checking his heavy diamond-encrusted gold watch and constantly looking around the massive sanctuary to make absolutely sure that people were noticing his presence. They all looked incredibly smug and entirely untouchable. They foolishly thought they had brilliantly secured their long-term financial future by legally stealing my business equity the day before. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting directly on top of a ticking, highly explosive financial time bomb. The massive choir finally finished their final soaring, powerful note, and the congregation of over 3,000 people quickly erupted into thunderous, enthusiastic applause. Pastor Williams, a highly charismatic man with a booming, authoritative baritone voice and a perfectly lined, sharp beard, stepped confidently up to the clear acrylic podium. He warmly welcomed the numerous visitors, made a few highly practiced, light-hearted jokes about the miserable summer heat, and then formally shifted the tone to the serious business portion of the morning service. He loudly announced that the church was officially kicking off its annual, highly publicized, multi-million-dollar fundraising drive specifically intended for the brand-new youth center and the expanding community outreach programs. This was Beatrice's highly anticipated, carefully calculated moment. As the current vice chair of the Church Finance Committee, she had the exclusive, highly visible privilege of making the formal opening remarks. She stood up quickly, dramatically, smoothing out the wrinkles in her bright yellow skirt, and practically strutted up the plush, red, carpeted steps to the elevated pulpit. She deliberately adjusted the microphone stand, letting out a loud, highly theatrical sigh of deep, fake, spiritual fulfillment. "Praise the Lord, my beautiful church family." She began, her voice echoing loudly and sharply through the massive hanging speakers above. "We are so incredibly blessed to be gathered together here today in this breathtaking sanctuary." As many of you already know, I am formally running for president of the trustee board because I deeply passionately believe in building a lasting legacy. I firmly believe in aggressively securing the financial future for our precious children. And absolutely nobody understands the critical, undeniable importance of generational wealth and cheerfully giving back quite like my family does. She paused deliberately and strategically, waiting patiently for the predictable murmurs of agreement and the scattered supportive amens from her wealthy, influential circle of friends sitting comfortably in the reserved front pews. She smiled brightly, gesturing grandly and theatrically down toward the front row, where DeAndre was sitting with his legs confidently crossed. I am so incredibly proud to stand up here today and publicly announce that my brilliant, highly successful son-in-law, DeAndre Vance, is personally leading our massive fundraising efforts this beautiful morning. DeAndre has been so immensely incredibly blessed in his highly lucrative commercial real estate ventures this past year. He truly and deeply understands that to whom much is given, much is absolutely required. Therefore, DeAndre and my beautiful, talented daughter Chloe are formally proudly pledging a massive donation of exactly $50,000 to the new youth fund today. The entire massive sanctuary instantly erupted in loud, sustained, echoing applause. People stood up quickly from their comfortable velvet pews, aggressively clapping and loudly cheering at the massive, impressive financial number. DeAndre stood up quickly, casually buttoning his ridiculous velvet blazer, proudly waving to the cheering crowd with a wide, intensely arrogant, completely unearned smile. Chloe stood up right next to him, dramatically blowing kisses to the audience and actually pretending to gently wipe a fake emotional tear from her perfectly made-up eye. It was a perfectly orchestrated, highly manipulative, incredibly transparent public relations stunt designed entirely to effortlessly secure Beatrice's upcoming election. Beatrice waited patiently and smugly for the heavy, echoing applause to finally die down completely before she firmly gripped the clear edges of the acrylic podium, leaning forward aggressively into the microphone. Her heavily mascaraed eyes scanned the massive, quiet crowd like a starving predator desperately searching for a wounded animal, until they finally locked directly onto me, sitting quietly and calmly in the middle aisle. The fake saccharine spiritual warmth in her loud voice vanished instantly, completely replaced by a sharp, highly condescending razor-thin edge. We all know perfectly well that not everyone has the required business acumen or the strict financial discipline to make such grand, highly impactful kingdom-building gestures, Beatrice said loudly, her voice heavily dripping with toxic manufactured fake pity. I see my struggling stepdaughter Zoe sitting quietly out there in the congregation. Zoe, honey, I know things have been incredibly painfully difficult for you lately. I know you sadly had to let go of your business equity just yesterday because you simply could not manage the intense pressure of the corporate business world. But absolutely every little bit helps build the kingdom. Can you please search your purse and possibly spare a few $100s for the needy youth today? We would all be so incredibly grateful for your tiny little contribution. The entire massive sanctuary went completely terrifyingly dead silent. Over 3,000 pairs of curious, judgmental eyes turned rapidly away from the pulpit to look directly at me. The blatant, aggressive public disrespect was heavy, thick, and entirely suffocating. She was intentionally, maliciously trying to strip me of my absolute dignity in front of the most powerful, wealthy, and influential people in the entire city. She desperately wanted me to shrink down into the hard wooden pew, thoroughly embarrassed, deeply humiliated, and completely financially defeated. She confidently expected me to lower my head in deep shame and silently endure the horrific public shaming. But I did not shrink. I did not blush. I did not show a single solitary ounce of public embarrassment. I calmly and smoothly reached into my expensive designer tote bag and pulled out my sleek silver iPad. As a senior forensic accountant, my private, highly respected firm personally handles the strict independent financial audits for Greater Zion Fellowship. Because of my exceptionally high-level security clearance and my direct hands-on role in rigorously auditing their massive media and technology budget, my personal iPad was permanently securely synced directly to the church's complex wireless audiovisual network with absolute full administrative override privileges. I stood up slowly and gracefully from my seat. A soft, rapidly growing murmur of highly confused, frantic whispers rippled rapidly through the massive congregation as I stepped confidently out of my row and directly into the wide center aisle. I did not look angry, upset, or emotionally compromised. I looked entirely bored and strictly coldly professional. I walked slowly, deliberately, and rhythmically down the long, plush red carpet heading straight toward the elevated altar. Beatrice frowned deeply, her knuckles turning completely white as her aggressive grip tightened visibly on the metal microphone stand. "Zoe, what exactly in the world are you doing?" she hissed softly, completely forgetting her sweet angelic church voice for a fraction of a second. "Please just sit down right now, you are causing an absolutely unnecessary scene." I ignored her completely and utterly. I walked straight up the carpeted stairs, bypassing Beatrice entirely without a single glance, and approached Pastor Williams, who was currently sitting deeply in a high-backed leather chair right behind the clear pulpit. I gave him a brief, highly respectful, professional nod. "Pastor," I said quietly, but incredibly firmly, "I deeply apologize, but I urgently need to borrow the main projection screens for a critical real-time financial update regarding the immediate church operating accounts." He looked incredibly confused and slightly alarmed, but he nodded slowly, gesturing openly toward the pulpit. Beatrice aggressively tried to physically block my path, stepping sideways quickly to completely cut me off, but I stepped neatly and smoothly around her obnoxious yellow suit and placed my silver iPad directly on the acrylic stand right next to her campaign notes. I tapped the glass screen exactly 3 times securely, entering my complex administrative passcode, and completely bypassed the entire media team currently sitting high up in the massive rear sound booth. High above the sprawling altar, the 3 massive high-definition projection screens that usually displayed the colorful hymn lyrics suddenly flickered to pitch black. A split second later, they brilliantly illuminated with a crisp, highly magnified crystal-clear image of a secure federal banking portal. It was a direct, live feed from the church's primary highly secure receiving account. Displayed heavily in massive, bright red, undeniable letters across the 3 giant screens was a live banking notification. I leaned forward slightly and adjusted the microphone perfectly to my exact height. I looked out coldly over the massive sea of completely shocked, breathless faces, then looked directly down at DeAndre, whose arrogant, smug smile had instantly vanished entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated, sickening panic. "I am sorry, Pastor," I announced into the mic, my voice steady and unwavering. "DeAndre's $50,000 check just bounced. Actually, all of his accounts are frozen." The congregation gasped in absolute horrified disbelief. For a fraction of a second, the massive sanctuary was so quiet, you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning units. Then absolute chaos erupted. DeAndre violently shoved his way out of the front pew, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. He tripped over the hem of Beatrice's ridiculous yellow skirt, caught his balance, and charged straight up the red-carpeted center aisle toward the elevated altar. "You lying witch!" DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking wildly as it echoed against the vaulted ceiling. "She hacked me. Pastor, she is a bitter, jealous liar. She illegally hacked into my private financial portals. Have her arrested right now." He was sweating profusely, dark patches rapidly blooming under the arms of his expensive maroon velvet blazer. Several broad-shouldered ushers in dark suits immediately stepped out from the side aisles to intercept him, but Pastor Williams held up a firm, authoritative hand signaling them to hold their positions. The pastor looked completely bewildered, his eyes darting frantically between my silver iPad, the giant projection screens displaying the bounced check notification, and my perfectly calm face. I did not flinch as DeAndre aggressively approached the acrylic podium. I simply looked down at him from my elevated position. I did not hack anything, DeAndre, I said smoothly, ensuring my voice remained completely level and amplified through the microphone for every single person in the room to hear clearly. I am a federally licensed forensic accountant. I do not need to hack bank accounts when I legally own them. DeAndre stopped dead in his tracks at the base of the altar stairs. His jaw went slack. The entire congregation leaned forward collectively, completely captivated by the unraveling drama. I tapped the screen of my iPad once more. The image on the massive projection screens above me instantly shifted from the bounced check notification to a highly complex corporate organizational chart. Let me explain exactly how high-level finance works to someone who leases his entire lifestyle, I continued coldly. Yesterday morning, I was officially appointed as the sole executor and primary beneficiary of the Washington Family Offshore Blind Trust. It is an airtight financial entity established decades ago by my late grandfather. I paused, letting the heavy weight of my grandfather's respected name sink into the minds of the older church members who remembered him well. What you and Beatrice never bothered to research, DeAndre, is that this specific blind trust operates a massive umbrella of subsidiary holding companies. One of those subsidiaries is the exact commercial lending firm you have been desperately using to fund your imaginary real estate empire. You thought you were so incredibly smart yesterday when you convinced my father to hand over my 15% business equity. You thought that equity would be enough to secure your new $5 million loan, but you were completely wrong. DeAndre was shaking his head rapidly, his eyes wide and panicked as he looked back at the congregation, desperately trying to salvage his shattered public image. This is a setup, he yelled frantically. I have the assets. I have the collateral. My business is completely solid. You do not have a business. DeAndre, I corrected him sharply, my voice cutting through his pathetic lies like a surgical blade. You have a massive mountain of unsecured toxic debt. And since you just brought up collateral, let us show the church family exactly what you used to secure your previous high-interest loans. I tapped the iPad a final time. The corporate chart disappeared instantly, replaced by a highly detailed, legally binding deed of trust. I had highlighted the most critical sections in bright yellow. My father David suddenly stood up from the front pew. His face had drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He stared up at the massive screens, his eyes squinting to read the legal jargon. Zoe, what is that document? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. That David is a commercial property lien, I answered directly, looking him right in the eyes. DeAndre did not just use his fake business ledgers to get cash. He secretly leveraged the only massive tangible asset he had access to. To secure his funding last year, DeAndre quietly put up the family's primary estate as his personal collateral. He forged your signature on the corporate guarantee forms to mortgage the 6-bedroom brick colonial mansion that you and Beatrice currently sleep in. A collective deafening shockwave ripped through the sanctuary. Women covered their mouths in horror. Men shook their heads in deep disgust. David turned slowly to look at DeAndre. His hands were shaking violently. You mortgaged my house, David whispered, the devastating betrayal completely shattering his usual cowardly demeanor. You used my home. Beatrice told me you were just running routine credit checks on the business accounts. She said you were handling the taxes. DeAndre backed away from David, his hands raised defensively. Pop, listen to me, it was just a temporary bridge loan. He stammered, his voice pathetic and entirely stripped of its usual extreme arrogance. I was going to pay it back as soon as the downtown property flipped. I swear I had the cash flow lined up. But you do not have the cash flow, I interrupted loudly, delivering the absolute final crushing blow. Because yesterday morning, the moment I took control of the blind trust, I legally froze every single one of your overextended credit lines pending a full federal fraud investigation. Because your accounts were frozen, your massive automatic mortgage payment failed to process at midnight last night. Your grace period expired. I looked directly at Beatrice, who was still sitting in the front pew, her mouth hanging open in absolute unadulterated terror. The mansion is now officially in default. Beatrice, I stated clearly. The blind trust holds the note, which means as of this morning, I personally own your house. Beatrice let out a sharp, high-pitched, absolutely blood-curdling wail. The realization that she had instantly lost her sprawling estate, her immense social standing, and her entire fake identity completely broke her fragile image-obsessed mind. Her eyes rolled back into her head, her heavy feather hat slipping sideways as she completely collapsed backward into the plush velvet pew. She had actually genuinely fainted. Complete bedlam erupted. Two nurses from the church health ministry immediately rushed down the aisle to attend to Beatrice, frantically fanning her face and checking her pulse. David stood completely frozen in place, staring blankly at the massive screens above his entire world crumbling into dust. DeAndre took advantage of the massive confusion, turning on his heel and literally sprinting down the side aisle toward the rear exit doors, abandoning his wife and his mother-in-law without a single second thought. I simply disconnected my iPad from the podium, picked up my designer bag, and walked calmly down the altar stairs. I did not stay to watch the medical team revive Beatrice. I had delivered exactly what I came to deliver. As I made my way out through the massive, echoing church lobby, I heard the frantic clicking sound of high heels aggressively rushing up behind me. I turned around just in time to see Chloe storming toward me. Her face flushed red with extreme anger and humiliation. Her carefully curated Instagram persona had completely evaporated, leaving behind a spoiled, vicious child having a massive temper tantrum. "You ruined everything!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing loudly off the marble lobby floors. Dozens of church members who had slipped out early stopped to watch the spectacle. "You are just a bitter, lonely, miserable woman. You have always been insanely jealous of me. You are jealous that I have a husband, and you have nobody. You planned this whole evil thing just to destroy my perfect marriage because nobody will ever love you." I stopped walking and looked at her. I did not feel angry. I only felt a deep, profound sense of pity for how completely delusional she was. "Chloe, your husband just ran out the back door and left you here to deal with the fallout of his massive federal felonies," I said quietly, my tone completely flat. "I did not ruin your marriage. Your marriage was a financial transaction built entirely on lies, and the check just bounced. I suggest you stop screaming at me and start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney." I turned my back on her before she could formulate another pathetic insult. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the blinding, sweltering Sunday heat, leaving the chaotic circus far behind me. The drive back to my luxury high-rise condo was incredibly peaceful. I rolled the windows up, turned the air conditioning on high, and drove in complete, satisfying silence. When I finally pulled into my secure underground parking garage, the heavy weight of decades of emotional abuse felt permanently lifted from my shoulders. I rode the private elevator up to my penthouse floor. My condo was a sleek, minimalist sanctuary of polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the sprawling city skyline and modern art that I had purchased with my own legitimate salary. It was the exact opposite of the cluttered fake traditionalism of my father's house. I walked into my massive kitchen, dropped my keys on the marble island, and poured myself a heavy glass of expensive red wine. I walked over to the massive window, looking out over the city, savoring the absolute victory. I had successfully completely dismantled their false reality. They had nothing left to leverage against me. But as I took my first sip of wine, a sharp, incredibly aggressive knock echoed rapidly from my heavy front door. I frowned, setting the wine glass down. My building had strict 24-hour security downstairs. Nobody was allowed up to the penthouse level without my direct verbal authorization. I walked over to the door and checked the digital security monitor. Standing in the brightly lit hallway was a tall, incredibly stern-looking man wearing a cheap gray suit and carrying a thick manila envelope. He was definitely not a resident. I pressed the intercom button. "Who are you, and how did you get past the lobby desk?" The man looked directly into the camera lens. "Miss Zoe Washington," he asked sharply. I am a licensed process server for the county court. Another resident held the lobby door open for me. I have highly sensitive legal documents that require your immediate physical signature of receipt. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open just a few inches. The man immediately thrust the thick envelope into my hands, handed me a digital clipboard, and pointed to the bottom line. You have been officially served, he said coldly. Have a nice afternoon. He turned and walked quickly toward the elevator bay before I could say another word. I shut the door, locked the deadbolt securely, and carried the heavy envelope back to the kitchen island. I tore the paper flap open and pulled out a massive stack of heavily stapled legal documents. The cover page was a formal, aggressively drafted cease and desist letter. But it was the second document that made my eyes narrow in cold, calculated anger. It was an emergency civil lawsuit filing from the most notorious, ruthless, and dirty legal defense firm in the entire city. Beatrice was not dead yet. She had somehow recovered from her dramatic fainting spell fast enough to call a ruthless attack dog lawyer. I read the primary charge printed boldly at the top of the legal filing. Beatrice was formally suing me for severe elder abuse, massive financial fraud, and the malicious manipulation of an incompetent senior citizen. She was legally claiming that I had psychologically tortured Grandma Loretta into signing over the $21 million blind trust, and she was demanding an immediate total emergency freeze on all of my personal and corporate financial assets. The war was absolutely not over. It was just moving into a much darker, much dirtier battlefield. I tossed the thick legal packet onto my marble kitchen island, the heavy thud echoing loudly in the quiet penthouse. I did not panic. I poured my glass of red wine down the sink, realizing I needed a completely clear head for what was coming next. I pulled out my reading glasses and began to meticulously dissect the emergency injunction filed by Victor Thorne, a defense attorney locally famous for aggressively representing the most corrupt politicians and shady real estate developers in the state. Beatrice had undoubtedly promised him a massive percentage of the trust to take this case on contingency, knowing she currently had absolutely zero access to her own frozen funds. The legal filing was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. It claimed that Grandma Loretta was suffering from advanced debilitating dementia and that I had maliciously isolated her from her loving caretakers. It stated that I had psychologically tortured an incompetent senior citizen into signing over a $21 million blind trust. The immediate demand was incredibly aggressive. Beatrice wanted a total emergency freeze placed on my $7 million cashier check, a complete reversal of the property foreclosure I had initiated against her mansion, and full reinstatement of her power of attorney. She was actively asking a judge to legally declare me a financial predator. They were throwing everything they had at the wall in a desperate, frantic attempt to regain control of their shattered fake reality. As I read through the completely fabricated affidavits signed by Beatrice and Chloe, my personal cell phone sitting on the counter began to vibrate violently. It did not stop. The screen lit up with a relentless rapid-fire barrage of incoming text messages and missed calls. I picked it up and unlocked the screen. The absolute worst element of toxic family dynamics is how quickly extended relatives will blindly rally behind the loudest, most manipulative victim in the room. Aunts, uncles, and distant cousins who had not bothered to call me on my birthday in over a decade were suddenly flooding my inbox with pure venom. Aunt Shirley, my father's deeply religious and highly hypocritical sister, sent a massive paragraph calling me a greedy, disrespectful disgrace to the family name. She accused me of turning my back on the Lord and trying to steal the roof over my poor father's head. Cousin Jamal texted me a string of angry emojis, calling me an absolute sellout who cared more about money than blood. They had all completely bought into Beatrice's fabricated narrative without asking me for a single shred of context. They did not know about DeAndre mortgaging the family estate. They did not know about the bounce check at church. They only knew the incredibly twisted, highly sanitized version of events that Beatrice was aggressively spinning behind closed doors. Then a new voicemail notification popped up. It was from my father, David. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker, letting his cowardly, trembling voice fill my kitchen. Zoe, it is your father. The recording began his tone, a pathetic mixture of extreme exhaustion and misplaced anger. You have taken this vendetta way too far. Beatrice is completely hyperventilating in the guest bedroom. You embarrassed us in front of the entire church congregation, and now you are trying to steal the house. DeAndre made a minor business mistake, but we handle these things privately as a family. You need to call Victor Thorne right now, withdraw your ridiculous claims against the estate, and come over here to apologize to your stepmother. If you do not drop this instantly, I will have no choice but to support Beatrice in court. Do the right thing, Zoe. Be the bigger person. I let the voicemail finish playing the automated voice, prompting me to save or delete the message. I pressed delete. I did not feel a single ounce of heartbreak. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of childhood rejection that used to paralyze me whenever my father chose Beatrice over me. I only felt a cold, sharp, and highly calculated detachment. My father had actively chosen to protect a son-in-law who committed federal mortgage fraud over a daughter who tried to save him. He had officially made his bed, and now he was going to be forced to sleep in it. My phone buzzed again, this time with a push notification from Instagram. Chloe is currently live, the alert read. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight into my sleek, highly organized home office. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair and woke up my dual-monitor computer setup. On the left screen, I logged into a secondary anonymous social media account and pulled up Chloe's live video feed. The visual was an absolute masterclass in extreme manipulative public relations. Chloe was sitting on the floor of her expensive, heavily mortgaged living room wearing an oversized plain gray sweatshirt. She had intentionally scrubbed her face completely clean of her usual heavy makeup to appear exceptionally vulnerable and raw. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she was actively forcing out ugly theatrical sobs for an audience of over 500,000 followers. You guys, I do not even know how to say this. Chloe cried directly into her smartphone camera, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. My family is currently under attack. My estranged, incredibly bitter older sister is trying to destroy us. She is an angry, miserable person who has always been insanely jealous of my happiness and my beautiful marriage to DeAndre. She manipulated my poor, sick grandmother, who has severe dementia, into signing away our family estate. She is literally trying to throw my elderly parents out onto the street out of pure spite. I watched the live comment section scrolling rapidly up the side of the screen. Thousands of absolute strangers were aggressively validating her toxic lies. They were sending praying hands emojis and typing out horrific racially charged insults directed entirely at me. Chloe was intentionally weaponizing the angry black woman stereotype, expertly painting me as an aggressive, unhinged, and totally unreasonable villain who was ruthlessly attacking her perfectly innocent, loving family. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was actively rallying a massive digital mob to intimidate me into dropping the foreclosure. But the absolute peak of her grift came a few minutes later. DeAndre has been working so incredibly hard to provide for us. Chloe sobbed, her voice breaking dramatically. But my sister illegally hacked into his business accounts and froze everything we have. We cannot even afford to buy groceries right now. I have linked a GoFundMe in my bio for legal fees to help us fight this evil woman and save my parents' home. Any little bit helps, guys. Please protect my family. I stared at the screen, a slow, highly dangerous smile spreading across my face. Chloe was committing wire fraud live on the internet, actively soliciting donations under entirely false pretenses, while fully knowing her husband had forged federal loan documents. She was digging her own grave deeper with every single word she spoke. I turned my attention away from her pathetic theatrical performance and focused entirely on my right monitor. I opened my highly secure encrypted forensic accounting software. While Chloe was crying for $5 donations from her gullible internet followers, I was aggressively tracking the massive panicked financial movements of her husband. DeAndre was currently making a series of incredibly sloppy, highly desperate mistakes. When I froze his primary domestic credit lines, I had deliberately left one tiny, seemingly insignificant offshore routing portal open just to see if he would take the bait. He took it hook, line, and sinker. The software dashboard lit up with a rapid series of bright red alerts. DeAndre was actively attempting to wire $200,000 of stolen corporate funds from a hidden shell company account directly to an unregulated bank in the Cayman Islands. He was frantically trying to hide his stolen cash before the federal authorities could officially seize it. I watched the data packets routing through the digital servers in real time. I captured his specific IP address, documented the exact timestamps, and downloaded the complete digital ledger of his illegal offshore transfers. He was executing these transactions from his personal laptop, completely unaware that I had full administrative oversight of the blind trust subsidiaries he was desperately trying to steal from. I compiled the massive mountain of irrefutable digital evidence into a single, highly encrypted, meticulously organized digital file. I opened my secure email client and drafted a new message directed to Investigator Reynolds at the Internal Revenue Service, aggressively copying the lead federal prosecutor for the Southern District. I attached the emergency injunction filed by Beatrice's dirty lawyer, firmly highlighting her absurd claim that I was the one committing financial fraud. I then attached the live screen recording of Chloe's GoFundMe scam, and finally the undeniable proof of DeAndre's active offshore money laundering attempts. I typed a single incredibly concise sentence in the body of the email. Here is the active flight risk documentation you requested, along with supplementary evidence of public wire fraud. I sat back in my leather chair listening to Chloe continue to sob uncontrollably on my left monitor while the final data transfer completed on my right. I moved my cursor over the send button. I did not hesitate. I smiled, clicked send, and watched the email vanish into the federal server. Less than 48 hours after Victor Thorne filed his ridiculous emergency injunction against me, the battlefield shifted entirely from the legal system to the digital world. I sat at my sleek home office desk, sipping a cup of dark roast black coffee, my eyes firmly locked onto my left computer monitor. Chloe had scheduled a highly publicized digital healing circle for her massive audience of Instagram followers. It was an absolute masterclass in extreme manipulative public relations, designed entirely to paint me as an unhinged villain, and herself as a tragic innocent victim of my supposed jealousy. Chloe was sitting cross-legged on her incredibly expensive living room rug, aggressively burning a thick bundle of white sage to supposedly cleanse the negative energy from her highly mortgaged home. She was intentionally wearing an oversized plain gray designer hoodie that cost more than most people make in a single week, and she had scrubbed her face completely clean of her usual heavy makeup to appear exceptionally vulnerable and raw. Her GoFundMe campaign link was pinned directly to the top of the live chat, the donation total slowly creeping past $4,000 as gullible strangers eagerly sent her their hard-earned money. "You guys," she whispered into her smartphone camera, her voice trembling with perfectly timed, highly manufactured emotional exhaustion. "The spiritual warfare my beautiful family is currently enduring is absolutely unimaginable. My estranged sister is operating out of pure, unadulterated darkness. She manipulated our grandmother, who has severe dementia, into signing away our family estate. She is actively trying to evict my elderly parents from their home. She hacked into my husband's accounts to destroy his legitimate business out of sheer bitter spite. But we are standing firm in our truth today. We are protecting our peace, our love, and our generational wealth." In the background of the live video feed, completely ruining her carefully crafted illusion of spiritual victimhood, DeAndre was aggressively pacing back and forth across the polished hardwood floor. He was wearing a tight black athletic shirt, loudly talking on his cell phone, and arrogantly flexing a massive diamond-encrusted watch for the camera every time he walked through the frame. He thought he had successfully wired his stolen corporate funds offshore to the Cayman Islands the night before. He was completely blinded by his own massive arrogance, boasting loudly to whoever was on the other end of the call about a new beachfront commercial property he was supposedly closing on by the end of the month. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair watching the absolute absurdity of their theatrical performance. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I only felt a cold, highly calculated sense of anticipation. I glanced down at the digital clock in the corner of my right monitor. It was exactly 12:14 in the afternoon. According to the brief, highly encrypted email reply I had received from Investigator Reynolds at the Internal Revenue Service earlier that morning, the tactical window was rapidly closing. The federal trap I had meticulously set was about to snap violently shut. Suddenly, a massive, thunderous pounding echoed loudly through Chloe's live video feed. It was not a polite standard knock. It was the heavy, authoritative window rattling strike of federal law enforcement. The incredibly loud sound completely drowned out the soft, ambient meditation music playing from the smart speakers in Chloe's living room. Chloe jumped slightly, looking incredibly annoyed rather than alarmed. She rolled her teary eyes dramatically at the camera lens. "Hold on a second, you guys," she sighed deeply, picking up her smartphone from its portable ring light tripod. "That must be my expensive organic green juice delivery. The driver is knocking like an absolute maniac today. Let me go grab it so we can continue our safe space healing session." She walked casually through her heavily mortgaged house, completely unaware that she was carrying 500,000 live viewers directly toward the absolute destruction of her entirely fake life. The heavy pounding struck the front door again, rattling the expensive frosted glass panes so hard they threatened to shatter. Chloe reached the grand front entryway, balancing her phone in one hand while she aggressively yanked the heavy mahogany door open with the other. "What is your absolute problem?" she started to yell, fully expecting to berate a minimum-wage delivery driver for interrupting her lucrative livestream. She froze completely, all the blood instantly drained from her face. The live video feed captured the terrifying, undeniable reality standing on her front porch. It was not a food delivery driver holding a paper bag. It was 6 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests with the bright yellow letters FBI printed massively across their chests. "Are you Chloe Vance, the lead tactical agent?" asked his voice, incredibly sharp, cold, and echoing loudly through the microphone of her phone. Chloe was completely speechless. Her mouth hung open in absolute terror. The smartphone shook violently in her trembling hand as the horrific reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her. The lead agent did not wait for her pathetic, stammering response. His eyes looked past her and locked directly onto DeAndre, who had frozen dead in his tracks in the exact center of the living room, his cell phone still pressed tightly to his ear. DeAndre Vance, the agent, barked loudly, stepping forcefully over the threshold and directly into the house, completely ignoring Chloe. "We have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest. Drop the phone and show me your hands right now." DeAndre dropped his phone, the expensive device clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. Pure, unadulterated panic completely consumed his face. Instead of complying with the direct federal order, his absolute arrogance and extreme stupidity took over his basic logic. He turned quickly and took 2 rapid, desperate steps toward the back patio sliding doors, foolishly attempting to run from a fully secured, highly coordinated federal raid. He did not even make it 3 feet. 2 massive federal agents rushed right past Chloe, completely shoving her out of the way. They hit DeAndre like a runaway freight train, tackling him incredibly hard onto the expensive hardwood floor. The heavy, sickening thud of his body hitting the ground echoed loudly through the live broadcast, followed instantly by the sound of breaking glass as he crashed into a designer coffee table. The live comment section on my computer screen absolutely exploded. The supportive praying hands emojis and the donations completely vanished instantly, entirely replaced by thousands of rapid-fire messages of pure shock, wild speculation, and intense mockery. The entire internet was actively watching the fake real estate mogul get physically subdued in real time. Chloe screamed a piercing, horrifying shriek and dropped her phone in a blind panic. The device hit the floor screen up, capturing a tilted, chaotic angle of the vaulted living room ceiling and the violent, aggressive scuffle happening just a few feet away. "Get your hands behind your back and stop resisting," An agent yelled loudly over the chaos. DeAndre Vance, you are under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, felony, identity theft, and the aggressive forgery of commercial lending documents. You have the wrong guy, DeAndre screamed frantically, his voice heavily muffled against the hardwood floor as an agent pressed a knee securely into his back. I am a legitimate commercial investor. I have legal equity in a massive corporate lumber company. You do not have equity, the lead agent replied coldly, the loud, distinct snap of heavy metal handcuffs clicking securely around DeAndre's wrists echoing clearly through the massive room. You have a forged corporate transfer agreement. We have the exact legal documents you submitted to the commercial banking underwriters yesterday afternoon. You fraudulently forged David Washington's executive signature to aggressively leverage his primary real estate. We also have the complete, undeniable digital ledger of your illegal offshore wire transfers, attempting to move stolen funds to the Cayman Islands last night. You are looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, completely losing her mind just off camera. You cannot take him away, she shrieked wildly, her voice cracking under the intense strain. We are raising money for a lawyer. My evil sister set us up. She illegally hacked our bank accounts and planted that evidence. Ma'am, step back immediately, or you will be placed under arrest right now for the direct obstruction of a federal investigation, another agent warned her sharply, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. Your husband is considered an extreme flight risk. We are legally seizing this property, freezing all affiliated financial accounts, and confiscating all electronic devices inside this residence immediately. A heavy black combat boot stepped directly over Chloe's dropped smartphone. A second later, a dark tactical glove reached down and picked up the device. The federal agent looked directly into the camera lens, immediately noticing the red live broadcast icon flashing brightly in the top corner of the screen. He did not hesitate for a single second. The agent pressed a button on the side of the phone, and the live video feed on my computer monitor instantly went completely black. I sat in the absolute beautiful silence of my penthouse home office. The incredibly satisfying conclusion of my carefully laid financial trap washed completely over me. DeAndre was going straight to federal prison. The forged transfer documents that Beatrice and my father had aggressively forced me to sign just yesterday had been the exact rope DeAndre used to hang himself. By formally transferring my equity to his shell company, I had legally distanced myself from the massive crater he just created, leaving him holding the undeniable federally monitored bag of stolen assets. Less than 30 seconds after the live stream abruptly ended, my cell phone sitting on the edge of the desk began to ring violently. I did not need to look at the caller identification screen. I knew exactly who was frantically dialing my number. I picked up the phone, accepted the call, and pressed the cool device slowly to my ear. Zoe Beatrice screamed at the absolute top of her lungs. Her voice was completely shredded, entirely stripped of its usual bougie arrogance, and replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. What did you do? Federal agents just raided Chloe's house. They dragged DeAndre out in handcuffs in front of the entire neighborhood. Chloe is completely hysterical. She said they are seizing her house and her bank accounts. What did you do to my family? I listened to her frantically hyperventilate through the speaker, thoroughly savoring the absolute desperation in her voice. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out the massive window at the sprawling, sunlit city skyline. You told me blood is blood, Beatrice, I replied, my voice completely smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of any mercy. You told me that DeAndre was building your generational wealth. I did not do anything to your family. I just gave the federal government the exact same financial documents you proudly forced me to sign yesterday. I am not destroying your family. I am just balancing the ledger, Beatrice. I did not block her number. I wanted her to sit in the suffocating silence, fully realizing that her reign of terror was officially over. But extreme desperation breeds extreme recklessness. With DeAndre sitting in a cold federal holding cell facing decades in prison, and her access to the family's massive credit lines completely severed, Beatrice made a massive, fatal mistake. She panicked. Instead of taking a step back to evaluate the massive crater she was currently standing in, she instructed her corrupt defense attorney, Victor Thorne, to aggressively fast-track the emergency probate hearing. She petitioned the county judge to bump our court date to the very next morning, desperate to regain control of the blind trust before the commercial bank initiated the formal foreclosure proceedings on her mansion and threw her out into the street. Later that evening, the secure intercom in my penthouse buzzed loudly. My building concierge informed me that my father was standing in the marble lobby, practically begging the security guards to let him come up. I authorized his entry, unlocking the private elevator. When the polished steel doors opened directly into my foyer, I barely recognized the man standing there. David looked utterly broken. He was wearing the exact same wrinkled gray suit he had worn to church yesterday. His shoulders slumped heavily, his face pale and deeply lined with sudden intense aging. He smelled faintly of stale scotch and extreme defeat. He stepped cautiously into my living room, looking around at my expensive modern art and custom furniture as if he was stepping onto an alien planet. "Zoe," he started, his voice cracking pitifully in the quiet room. "Please, I do not know what to do anymore. Beatrice is completely inconsolable. Chloe has locked herself in the guest bathroom and refuses to eat or speak to anyone. The bail bondsman wants 10% in cash to get DeAndre out of federal lockup, and every single credit card I own is declining. I need you to float me a massive loan, just until the business accounts are officially unfrozen. I need to bail him out for Chloe's sake." I stood leaning against the marble kitchen island, crossing my arms tightly over my chest. I stared at him, feeling absolutely nothing but profound clinical disgust. "You came to my home," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and dangerously steady, "to beg me for cash to bail out the man who forged your signature and mortgaged your primary house. You want me to use the money my grandfather left me to rescue a federal criminal just so your new wife will stop yelling at you." David rubbed his face with trembling hands, his eyes refusing to meet mine. "He is family, Zoe. Chloe desperately needs her husband right now. I know he made a terrible business mistake, but we have to stick together when things get hard." I pushed myself off of the marble island and closed the physical distance between us, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "Do not you ever use the word family with me?" I snapped, the decades of repressed anger finally breaking completely through my cold professional exterior. Where was this intense loyalty when Beatrice moved in and immediately boxed up all of my late mother's photographs? Where was this fierce protective instinct when she flatly refused to pay my college tuition and forced me to take out massive student loans while she bought Chloe a brand new luxury car for her 18th birthday? Where was my loving father when Beatrice publicly humiliated me at every single holiday dinner, telling me I was just a leftover burden from a dead woman? David shrank back toward the elevator, his eyes darting toward the floor. "Zoe." It was complicated. "Beatrice has a very strong personality, and I was just trying to keep the peace in the house." "You did not keep the peace, David." I fired back, my words hitting him like physical blows. "You chose her comfort over my safety. Every single time. You allowed a vain, greedy, deeply insecure woman to systematically tear your actual daughter down just so you would not have to deal with an argument before bedtime. You sacrificed my mental health to buy your own silence. And even yesterday, when they tried to steal the business equity, I bled to save you, sat behind your massive mahogany desk, and told me to just sign the papers and be quiet. You threw me to the wolves, David. Well, congratulations. The wolves are now starving, and I am the one holding the keys to the meat locker." Tears welled up in his eyes, a pathetic display of a weak man finally realizing the devastating permanent consequences of his lifelong cowardice. "Zoe, please. I am your father." "You were my father," I corrected him coldly. "Now you are just a terrible financial liability. I will not give you a single dime to save DeAndre. I will not stop the legal foreclosure on the mansion. You are going to lose absolutely everything because you consistently chose a fake life over reality. Get out of my house." He opened his mouth to argue, but the absolute terrifying finality in my eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. He turned around slowly, his posture entirely defeated, and shuffled back into the private elevator. The heavy steel doors closed permanently, erasing his pathetic presence from my sanctuary. The very next morning, I walked into the sleek, high-tech conference room of my own elite legal counsel. I had retained Marcus Sterling, the senior managing partner of the most prestigious corporate litigation firm in the entire state. Marcus was a brilliant, razor-sharp legal strategist who did not play dirty, but knew exactly how to dismantle those who did. As I took a seat at the heavy oak table, Marcus pushed a freshly printed stack of legal documents toward me. His usually calm, professional demeanor was entirely replaced by a look of intense, grim concern. Victor Thorne just filed a massive supplemental motion with the probate judge. An hour ago, Marcus explained, tapping his silver pen aggressively against the paperwork. Beatrice is not just making empty emotional accusations anymore. She has legally submitted physical medical records to the court. I pulled the documents toward me and carefully scanned the attached files. It was a complete, highly detailed neurological evaluation report bearing the official letterhead of a private medical clinic located on the wealthy outskirts of the city. The signature at the bottom of the diagnostic page belonged to a Dr. Eris Thorne. "Wait," I said, looking up at Marcus. "The doctor shares the exact same last name as her sleazy defense attorney." Marcus nodded grimly, his jaw clenching tight. "It is his younger brother. Eris Thorne runs a cash-only concierge medical clinic for the ultra-wealthy. He has a highly documented history of questionable ethical practices, but he has never been officially stripped of his medical license. According to these freshly minted documents, Eris Thorne claims he has been privately treating your grandmother Loretta for 3 consecutive years. He states on the official medical record that she suffers from severe advanced stage Alzheimer's disease." I read the fraudulent diagnostic notes carefully. The forged paperwork claimed that Loretta was entirely incapable of understanding basic financial concepts, could not recognize her own family members, and was highly susceptible to malicious manipulation by outside parties. Beatrice is playing her ultimate trump card. Marcus continued, his voice heavy with legal realism. By submitting these signed medical documents, she is providing the judge with expert medical testimony that instantly invalidates the $7 million cashier's check you deposited. If the judge accepts this medical evaluation, Loretta's transfer of the blind trust to you is legally voided. Beatrice will instantly be reinstated as the sole medical and financial power of attorney. I set the forged medical records back down onto the conference table, smoothing the paper flat with my hand. I did not look panicked. I did not feel the sudden crushing weight of impending defeat. "Zoe, you need to understand the absolute gravity of this situation," Marcus warned me, leaning across the table and looking directly into my eyes. "This is no longer just a civil dispute over a family trust. By depositing that massive check, you engaged in a major federal financial transaction. If the judge formally rules that Loretta was mentally incompetent, Victor Thorne is going to immediately push the district attorney to press criminal charges against you. You will lose the $21 million, you will permanently lose your forensic accounting license, and you could face serious federal jail time for the deliberate financial exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen. We have to figure out a way to aggressively discredit this doctor before the hearing tomorrow morning." I smiled. A slow, highly calculated, incredibly dangerous smile. I reached into the front pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a sleek, highly encrypted silver thumb drive. I placed it gently on the table right next to the forged medical documents. "Do not try to discredit the doctor, Marcus," I said quietly, leaning back in my chair with absolute unbothered confidence. "Let Victor Thorne submit those forged records to the judge. Let him enter them officially into the permanent legal record under the penalty of perjury. It is exactly what Grandma Loretta and I planned." The next morning, the sky over the city was a flat, unforgiving gray, perfectly matching the cold, sterile interior of Sterling & Associates. The elite law firm occupied the entire top floor of the tallest skyscraper in the financial district. It was a fortress of polished steel frosted glass, an aggressive corporate power. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, completely unbothered bun. I sat at the far end of the massive mahogany conference table, next to my attorney Marcus Sterling, waiting patiently for the absolute circus to arrive. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy frosted glass doors swung open. Beatrice walked into the room first, and her appearance was a masterful, highly calculated performance. She was dressed head to toe in somber funereal black Chanel. She wore oversized dark sunglasses indoors and carried a crumpled tissue in her gloved hand, perfectly playing the part of the deeply distressed, heartbroken matriarch bravely fighting to save her family from total ruin. Chloe trailed closely behind her, looking absolutely atrocious. With her husband sitting in a cold federal holding cell and her lucrative social media empire completely demolished, the fake influencer had entirely evaporated. Her face was pale and blotchy, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was shaking visibly, hugging her arms tightly around her chest, as if trying to physically hold her shattered reality together. My father, David, was noticeably absent. He was likely hiding in his office, too cowardly to face the devastating consequences of his own lifelong inaction. Victor Thorne flanked them, carrying a battered leather briefcase. He had the slick, overly polished look of a man who made his fortune defending the absolutely indefensible. He wore a loud pinstripe suit and an arrogant smirk, clearly believing he was about to orchestrate a massive legal victory against a terrified amateur accountant. He pulled out a high-backed leather chair for Beatrice with exaggerated courtesy before aggressively slapping his briefcase down onto the center of the mahogany table. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet room. "Let us skip the pleasantries," Victor Thorne announced loudly, his voice incredibly abrasive and dripping with unearned confidence. "We are not here to negotiate a friendly compromise. We are here to offer you a single, extremely generous opportunity to avoid spending the next 10 years in a federal women's penitentiary." Marcus Sterling folded his hands neatly on the table, his expression completely unreadable and strictly professional. "Proceed," Counselor Marcus said calmly. Victor Thorne snapped the brass latches of his briefcase open and pulled out a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents. He slammed the forged medical records directly onto the polished wood, pushing them aggressively toward the center of the table so both Marcus and I could clearly see the clinic letterhead. "These are certified medical evaluations signed by Dr. Eris Thorne." Victor stated proudly, entirely failing to mention the obvious glaring conflict of interest in their shared last name. "These documents legally and unequivocally prove that Loretta Washington has been suffering from advanced stage Alzheimer's disease for over 3 years. She lacks all basic cognitive function. She does not know what day it is, let alone understand the complex legal ramifications of signing over an offshore blind trust." Victor leaned forward, resting his knuckles heavily on the table, trying to physically intimidate me with his proximity. "By accepting that $7 million cashier's check, you deliberately committed massive financial fraud. You maliciously manipulated a vulnerable, mentally incompetent senior citizen to steal $21 million from her legitimate caretakers. This is textbook felony-level elder abuse. You exploited a sick woman for your own incredible greed." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I reached forward, picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the cold silence stretch out, forcing Victor to continue talking to fill the uncomfortable void. "My clients are willing to show incredible mercy," Victor sneered, his confidence swelling rapidly as he foolishly interpreted my silence as sheer terror. "If you sign a full legal surrender right now, we will agree not to press criminal charges with the district attorney. You will immediately forfeit the $7 million back into the primary trust account. You will completely drop the hostile foreclosure proceedings against the family estate. You will legally reinstate Beatrice as the sole financial and medical power of attorney. And finally, you will authorize an immediate wire transfer of $200,000 to cover DeAndre's federal bail and his upcoming legal defense fees. If you refuse these generous terms, I will walk straight from this conference room to the federal prosecutor's office and have you arrested for elder abuse before lunchtime. I gently placed my water glass back onto its silver coaster. The condensation ran slowly down the side of the glass. I looked directly at Beatrice. She had taken off her dark sunglasses, revealing eyes that were practically glowing with toxic, vindictive triumph. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had successfully backed me into a corner that I could not audit my way out of. "Go ahead, Zoe," Beatrice whispered, her voice dripping with fake, sickening sympathy. "Sign the papers. You have caused enough massive damage to this family. You sent my innocent son-in-law to jail. You humiliated us in front of the entire church congregation. You tried to throw your own father out onto the street. But I am a forgiving Christian woman. I am willing to let you walk away with your freedom if you just give back what you stole from us. Your father is sitting at home right now, his heart completely broken by your extreme greed. Do the right thing. Save yourself from a prison cell." I sat perfectly still. I did not interrupt her. I did not raise my voice or aggressively defend my character. I simply let her gloat. I let her spin her toxic manufactured narrative for a solid 5 minutes, allowing her to verbally dig her grave as deep as she possibly could. I listened as she continuously praised her own fake grace, her supposedly endless sacrifices for my family, and her absolute entitlement to my grandfather's wealth. I watched Chloe nod along frantically, desperately hoping this dirty legal maneuver would magically restore her fake wealthy lifestyle and bring her fraud of a husband home. When Beatrice finally finished her pathetic monologue, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with her crumpled tissue, I turned my attention back to Victor Thorne. "Are you officially entering these specific medical documents into the formal mediation record?" "Counselor," I asked quietly, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the court reporter sitting silently in the corner of the room, taking the official transcription. Victor smirked, tapping the stack of forged papers aggressively with his index finger. "They are officially submitted, Miss Washington. The evidence is on the record. The clock is ticking. You have exactly 2 minutes to decide if you want to be a free woman or a federal inmate." I looked at Marcus Sterling. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. By formally submitting the fabricated documents into the official mediation record, Victor and Beatrice had just crossed the absolute point of no return. They had legally committed perjury and the direct submission of fraudulent evidence in a high-stakes corporate legal proceeding. The trap was now permanently bolted shut and they were completely locked inside. I adjusted my posture, sitting up perfectly straight in my leather chair. The cold, entirely unbothered expression on my face finally made Victor Thorne's arrogant smirk falter slightly. He shifted his weight suddenly, realizing that I did not look like a terrified woman facing decades in federal prison. I looked like an apex predator who had just patiently waited for the prey to walk directly into the snare. I turned my head away from the sleazy defense attorney and looked directly at the senior partner of the law firm, who was sitting quietly and observing the entire interaction with cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice incredibly clear and echoing with absolute undeniable authority in the tense conference room, "I believe you have a message to deliver from your original client." Marcus Sterling did not say a single word. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a sleek silver remote control, and pressed a single button. The heavy mahogany paneling at the far end of the conference room slid seamlessly apart, revealing a massive 80-inch high-definition television screen. The screen flickered to life, bathing the tense room in bright, crisp light. Beatrice let out a sharp, confused gasp, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. Chloe stopped shaking and stared at the screen in absolute wide-eyed terror. Victor Thorne lost his arrogant smirk instantly, his eyes darting frantically between me, Marcus, and the massive display. Sitting right in the center of the screen, broadcast in incredibly clear, undeniable high definition, was Grandma Loretta. She was not sitting in a bleak, depressing nursing home room. She was not wearing a faded hospital gown, and she certainly did not look like a frail, incompetent woman suffering from advanced dementia. She was sitting comfortably in a plush velvet armchair inside a breathtaking, sun-drenched luxury penthouse suite overlooking the sparkling ocean. She was wearing a perfectly tailored emerald green silk blouse, her silver hair styled flawlessly. Her posture was incredibly straight, her eyes were razor sharp, and her expression was filled with absolute, unadulterated fury. "Hello, Beatrice Grandma," Loretta said, her raspy voice echoing with immense power and absolute clarity through the high-end surround sound speakers of the conference room. "I imagine you are sitting there right now, dressed in your absolute best designer clothes, trying desperately to convince a room full of highly intelligent lawyers that my brain has completely rotted away. I also imagine you just confidently submitted a massive stack of fake medical records to legally steal my legacy." Beatrice physically recoiled in her heavy leather chair as if she had just been slapped aggressively across the face. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked at Victor Thorne in sheer panic, but the sleazy defense attorney was completely frozen, staring at the screen, like a man watching his entire lucrative career violently crash and burn before his very eyes. "I have known exactly what you are for a very long time," Beatrice Loretta continued, leaning forward slightly toward the camera, her piercing gaze seemingly staring right through the digital screen and directly into Beatrice's dark, greedy soul. "I knew you were aggressively stealing from my local checking accounts. I knew you were secretly redirecting my pension funds to pay off your ridiculous, exorbitant credit card bills. I knew you maliciously convinced my foolish, cowardly son David to put me in that dreadful nursing facility so you could finally take complete control of the family estate. You thought I was just a weak, silent old woman waiting patiently to die. You thought I was completely oblivious to your toxic, destructive greed." Loretta paused, taking a slow, elegant sip from a crystal glass of iced tea resting on the table beside her. "But you made one massive, fatal miscalculation," she said, setting the glass down with a sharp clink. "You severely underestimated my absolute loyalty to the only person in this family who actually possesses my late husband's brilliant mind and fierce integrity. I have been secretly working directly with Zoe and Mr. Sterling for over a year. While you were busy buying expensive, ridiculous hats for church and parading around like fake royalty, Zoe was meticulously auditing every single stolen dime you took from me. We built an absolute fortress around my actual wealth, and we intentionally left you the crumbs to see exactly how greedy you would become." Victor Thorne suddenly shot up from his chair, his face flushed bright red with extreme panic. "This is completely inadmissible," he yelled frantically, desperately trying to salvage his rapidly imploding legal strategy. "This is a highly manipulated pre-recorded video. It proves absolutely nothing about her current mental state or her legal cognitive capacity. My medical documents are officially signed by a licensed physician." Marcus Sterling simply hit the pause button on the remote. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out 3 heavily bound, officially sealed medical dossiers, and slid them aggressively across the table until they hit Victor's expensive briefcase. "Those are certified, fully notarized psychiatric evaluations," Marcus stated coldly, entirely shutting down the corrupt lawyer. "They were conducted and signed by 3 of the absolute top board-certified neurologists in the entire country. They examined Loretta Washington for 6 exhaustive hours on the morning of July 4th, just hours before your client hosted her little barbecue. They unanimously declared her to be in the top 1 percentile of cognitive function for her age group. Your brother, Eris Thorne, is a known medical fraud victor, and by formally submitting his fabricated diagnosis to this mediation, you just committed severe, undeniable federal perjury." Victor Thorne's jaw practically unhinged. All the color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He stared at the 3 sealed dossiers as if they were live grenades about to detonate. He knew instantly that his corrupt brother's fake medical clinic was about to be raided by federal authorities, and his own law license was permanently, irreversibly destroyed. Marcus pressed play again, allowing Grandma Loretta to deliver the absolute final crushing blow. Now that my brilliant lawyers have completely destroyed your pathetic attempt at medical fraud, let us discuss the actual terms of my blind trust, Loretta announced, her voice dripping with extreme cold satisfaction. I intentionally designed the $7 million checks as a morality test, knowing perfectly well that your extreme arrogance would force you to reject them. But I also included a very specific ironclad legal stipulation in the foundational bylaws of the offshore trust. It is called a strict no contest clause. Beatrice began to hyperventilate. She gripped her chest, her heavy diamond necklaces clinking together loudly as she struggled desperately to pull air into her panicked lungs. The clause is incredibly simple, Loretta explained, smiling a sharp, ruthless smile. Any beneficiary or affiliate who actively attempts to aggressively contest the legal transfer of my wealth, or who maliciously submits fraudulent documentation to a court of law to steal, said wealth automatically triggers a total irreversible financial clawback. By hiring a dirty lawyer, by suing my rightful heir Zoe, and by legally submitting those forged medical records today, you did not just lose the trust. You legally authorized my executors to aggressively strip you of every single dime you ever touched from this family. Loretta leaned back in her plush velvet armchair, looking completely at peace. The trust now officially owns the mansion you sleep in. The trust owns the luxury cars you drive. The trust owns the clothes on your back and the diamonds around your neck. You are leaving this family exactly the way you entered it decades ago, Beatrice. Absolutely penniless. Do not ever try to contact me or my granddaughter again. Enjoy your new reality. The television screen instantly went completely black. The silence in the grand conference room was absolutely deafening. Chloe was openly sobbing, her face buried deeply in her hands, her entire fake life completely eradicated. Beatrice was staring blankly at the dark screen, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She had aggressively pushed all her chips into the center of the table, entirely confident she was holding a winning hand, only to realize she had been playing a completely different, highly rigged game the entire time. Victor Thorne scrambled frantically to pack his leather briefcase. He shoved his forged medical documents inside and snapped the brass latches shut with violently trembling hands. "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel," he stammered wildly, not even looking at Beatrice as he bolted aggressively toward the frosted glass doors. "This mediation is over." He yanked the heavy door open, desperately trying to escape the massive legal crater he had just dug for himself. But he did not make it a single step into the hallway. Standing directly outside the conference room were 4 uniformed city police officers, accompanied by 2 stern-looking detectives, wearing plain clothes and holding official court warrants. Victor Thorne, the lead detective, said, stepping forcefully into the room and completely blocking the exit. "You are under arrest for the deliberate submission of fraudulent evidence, massive legal perjury, and criminal conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Turn around and put your hands behind your back right now." As the officers aggressively cuffed the screaming, wildly protesting lawyer, the second detective walked calmly into the conference room. He completely ignored Chloe's hysterical crying and walked straight up to the mahogany table. He pulled a thick, heavily stamped legal document from his jacket pocket and dropped it directly in front of Beatrice. "Beatrice Washington," the detective announced coldly, his voice cutting fiercely through the chaotic noise. "You are hereby officially served with a grand jury subpoena for massive financial fraud and the aggressive forgery of federal medical documents. You are ordered to surrender your passport immediately." I sat quietly in my leather chair, taking another slow, highly satisfying sip of my sparkling water. The chaotic scene unfolding right in front of me was the absolute perfect culmination of a year of meticulous planning and silent endurance. The lead federal detective did not show a single ounce of pity for Beatrice. He handed her a thick black pen, strictly ordering her to sign the formal acknowledgement of the grand jury subpoena. Her manicured hand was shaking so violently that she dropped the pen twice onto the polished mahogany table. She was completely hyperventilating now, taking short, ragged gasps of air that made her chest heave in her expensive black Chanel suit. The heavy diamond necklace around her throat, which she had worn specifically to project an aura of untouchable wealth and ultimate power, now looked exactly like a glamorous, suffocating noose. She was legally bound to remain in the state, her passport was immediately revoked, and she was facing multiple felony charges for medical forgery and criminal conspiracy. Beside her, Chloe had descended into a state of absolute pathetic hysteria. The devastating reality of her total destruction was finally penetrating her thick, image-obsessed skull. She gripped her expensive hair extensions, pulling at them as she sobbed uncontrollably, her tears entirely ruining her carefully applied makeup. "I have absolutely nothing left," Chloe wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the corporate conference room, completely ignoring the detective standing just a few feet away. "DeAndre is locked in a federal holding cell. The government froze my personal checking accounts this morning. My Instagram sponsors are actively dropping my contracts because of the raid. I am entirely broke." She looked wildly around the room, desperately seeking a financial lifeline that simply did not exist anymore. Her entire identity, completely fabricated on stolen trust funds and rented luxury items, had evaporated into thin air in a matter of seconds. She was finally experiencing the exact vulnerability and isolation she had gleefully inflicted on me for my entire life. Just as the detective was formally instructing Beatrice on the strict travel restrictions of her federal subpoena, the heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room burst violently open. My father, David, stumbled into the room. He was completely out of breath, his expensive silk tie askew, his face flushed with panicked exertion. He had clearly received a frantic phone call from Beatrice right before the mediation started, or perhaps he had been cowardly waiting in the lobby downstairs, only rushing up when he saw Victor Thorne being hauled away in handcuffs by the city police. David was always playing the obedient, cowardly dog, running to his master's rescue, when it was already far too late. He froze dead in his tracks at the head of the table, his wide eyes darting from the federal detective standing directly over his hyperventilating wife to my completely unbothered posture at the other end of the room. "What in the world is happening here?" David demanded, his voice cracking pitifully as he tried to project an authority he absolutely did not possess. "Beatrice, why are the police here? Why is Victor in handcuffs?" I did not give Beatrice the opportunity to craft another pathetic, manipulative lie. I placed my crystal water glass down on the silver coaster, smoothed the front of my tailored navy suit, and stood up slowly from my leather chair. I picked up my designer tote bag and pulled out a single crisp manila envelope. I walked calmly and deliberately around the edge of the massive mahogany table, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the hardwood floor, until I stood directly in front of my completely broken stepmother. I dropped the brown envelope onto the table, letting it land right on top of her active federal subpoena. "That is a 24-hour eviction notice," I said, my voice echoing with cold, absolute finality. "The trust owns the house. You have until tomorrow at noon to pack your fake Birkins and get out." Beatrice stared down at the brown envelope as if it were highly radioactive. She could not even formulate a single coherent word. Her mouth opened and closed, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped her throat. David immediately stepped between us, holding his trembling hands up in a desperate, entirely useless placating gesture. "Zoe, please, you have to stop this right now," he begged, his eyes wide with sheer terror, as he finally realized the absolute magnitude of his imminent financial ruin. "You cannot kick us out of our own home. Where are we supposed to go? We do not have access to the business accounts. We are your family. Family sticks together when things get tough. You have to find it in your heart to forgive this minor misunderstanding. We can fix this quietly." I looked at the man who had completely failed to protect me my entire life. I did not feel a single shred of anger anymore. I did not feel the familiar childhood ache of desperate longing for his approval. I just felt an overwhelming clinical disgust. "Family sticks together," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that instantly commanded the undivided attention of everyone in the room, including the seasoned detectives. "Let us talk about exactly how you stick together, David. Did you stick with me when my mother died, and you let Beatrice box up every single photograph of her just 2 weeks after the funeral, because looking at her face made your new wife feel deeply insecure? Did you protect my memory of her when Beatrice threw away my mother's favorite books just to clear shelf space for her ridiculous decorative vases? David flinched violently, his eyes dropping to the floor as the ugly, undeniable truth hit him squarely in the chest. Did you stick with me when I was an 18-year-old girl begging for help with my college tuition? I continued stepping closer to him, forcing him to hear every single word. You sat in absolute silence at the dinner table while Beatrice told me I needed to pull my own weight and take out massive student loans. You let her say that right before she bought Chloe a brand new luxury Mercedes with my grandfather's money for her high school graduation. Did you stick with me when your fraudulent son-in-law mocked my career and told me to use my grandmother's check as toilet paper in front of 50 guests at your ridiculous barbecue? David tried to speak, raising a weak hand, but I cut him off instantly. No, you did not, I stated firmly, effectively shutting down his pathetic attempt at an excuse. You looked at the ground, and you flipped burgers. You let them humiliate me. You let them steal from me. And you even actively tried to hand my hard-earned business equity over to a federal criminal yesterday just to keep your house quiet. You allowed a vain, greedy, deeply toxic woman to systematically tear your actual daughter down just so you would not have to deal with an argument before bedtime. I took a deep breath, feeling the massive, heavy chains of my childhood trauma finally snapping and falling away completely. You made your choice decades ago, David, I said, delivering the absolute final blow to his shattered ego. You chose a fake, shiny life over your own flesh and blood. You chose the comfortable illusion of wealth over actual integrity. And now that illusion is completely over. I am not your family anymore. I am your landlord, and your lease is officially terminated. I turned my back on him. I did not wait for a response, and I certainly did not care if he cried. I nodded respectfully to Marcus Sterling, who was watching me with a look of profound professional pride, and I briefly acknowledged the detectives who were finishing their official paperwork. I walked straight out of the conference room, leaving the heavy frosted glass doors wide open behind me. I did not look back at the chaotic, sobbing, utterly pathetic mess I left behind. They were entirely someone else's problem now. I walked down the quiet, thickly carpeted hallway of the elite law firm and pressed the glowing down button for the private elevator. The polished steel doors slid open instantly with a soft chime, and I stepped inside the completely empty cab. The doors glided shut, sealing me inside a quiet, peaceful sanctuary of sleek metal and soft lighting. As the elevator began its rapid, completely silent descent toward the massive marble lobby on the ground floor, I reached into my designer bag and pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my text messages, ignoring a final frantic missed call from Aunt Shirley, and opened my highly secure private banking application. The biometric scanner read my face and the screen instantly refreshed. A bright green notification popped up prominently at the very top of my digital ledger. I smiled, a genuine, deeply satisfying smile that reached all the way to my eyes. The $7 million cashier check had officially cleared. I woke up the next morning feeling a profound, unbroken peace that I had not experienced since I was a little girl. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that used to tightly grip my chest whenever I had to deal with my family had completely vanished. I got dressed in a sharp, tailored gray business suit, pulled my hair back into a sleek professional style, and prepared to officially reclaim my grandfather's legacy. It was exactly 11 o'clock in the morning when my hired black executive SUV pulled smoothly into the sprawling, circular cobblestone driveway of the Washington family estate. I did not come alone to this final confrontation. Early that morning, I had contracted a highly elite private corporate security firm specifically trained in high-asset physical evictions. 4 massive, completely no-nonsense brothers stepped out of the heavy vehicle right behind me. They were impeccably dressed in dark, tailored suits, wearing dark sunglasses and discreet communication earpieces. They projected an aura of absolute, uncompromising, and terrifying authority. I had explicitly instructed the security captain that there would be zero physical violence today, but there would also be absolutely zero negotiation or extensions granted. The heavy mahogany front door was completely unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the grand marble foyer, the sharp click of my heels echoing loudly in the massive cavernous space. The interior of the beautiful house was in a state of absolute frantic, pathetic chaos. Expensive clothing items, velvet hangers, and shoeboxes were strewn wildly across the curved, grand staircase. Beatrice was frantically barking high-pitched hysterical orders at Chloe, who was aggressively dragging an overstuffed, incredibly heavy leather suitcase across the pristine white living room carpet. When they suddenly heard my footsteps and saw me standing in the wide doorway, completely flanked by a solid wall of silent, towering security personnel, all frantic movement in the house completely stopped. "You have exactly 1 hour until the noon deadline," I announced, my voice carrying clearly and coldly through the massive house. "Anything left inside the walls of this property after the clock strikes 12 officially belongs to the offshore trust. I highly suggest you stop crying and start moving significantly faster." Beatrice opened her mouth, her face flushed red with a highly toxic mixture of extreme rage and absolute undeniable terror. She wanted to scream at me, to curse my name, to assert her fake dominance one last time. But the lead security officer took a single heavy step forward, firmly folding his massive arms across his broad chest. Beatrice instantly snapped her mouth shut. The brutal reality of her dire situation had finally pierced completely through her thick delusional armor. She was entirely powerless, and she knew it. Watching them attempt to pack their belongings was an absolute masterclass in completely misplaced priorities. Instead of grabbing practical necessary items like winter coats, important personal documents, or sensible walking shoes, they were frantically trying to stuff fragile, highly expensive designer handbags, imported crystal vases, and ridiculous feathered church hats into whatever cardboard boxes they could rapidly find. They were desperately trying to salvage the fake hollow image of their extravagant wealth, rather than actually preparing for the incredibly harsh reality of their brand new poverty. Chloe was sobbing loudly, aggressively, complaining to absolutely nobody that her expensive acrylic manicure was chipping as she struggled violently to zip a massive canvas duffel bag closed. At exactly 10 minutes to noon, the lead security officer checked his heavy steel tactical watch and cleared his throat loudly. "Time is officially up, ladies," he commanded, his deep, rumbling voice leaving absolutely no room for debate or delay. "Please step outside the residence immediately. You are now trespassing on private corporate property." Beatrice tried to argue frantically, claiming she desperately needed more time to securely wrap her expensive jewelry collection in the upstairs safe, but the large guards simply began walking slowly and deliberately toward them. Their immense physical presence forced Beatrice and Chloe to back up frantically toward the open front door. They had absolutely no choice but to grab whatever heavy bags they could physically carry and drag them out onto the front porch, stepping out into the blistering, unforgiving afternoon sun. The massive front lawn of the Washington estate had always been Beatrice's ultimate pride and joy. It was perfectly manicured, aggressively green, and constantly maintained by a dedicated team of highly expensive landscape architects. Now it served as the incredibly public, completely exposed stage for her ultimate social downfall. The security team firmly instructed Beatrice and Chloe to drag their massive, overflowing suitcases, their black trash bags filled with designer shoes, and their loose, wrinkled clothing items directly onto the bright green grass right near the edge of the public street. This was a highly exclusive, heavily patrolled, gated community. The wealthy residents were incredibly nosy, deeply judgmental, and constantly looking for the latest neighborhood scandal to discuss over their expensive Sunday brunches. As Beatrice stood sweating profusely in the sweltering heat, wearing a wrinkled silk blouse, and struggling to balance a towering stack of heavy hat boxes, the affluent neighbors began to drive by. A sleek silver Lexus slowed down to an absolute crawl. I recognized the driver immediately. It was Mrs. Henderson, the incredibly influential head of the Neighborhood Homeowner Association and a highly prominent elder at Greater Zion Fellowship. She rolled her tinted window down slightly, her eyes wide with shock and intense gossipy delight, as she took in the horrific, undeniable scene of Beatrice being physically evicted by massive security guards in broad daylight. Beatrice desperately tried to hide her face behind a large designer handbag, her entire body shaking with extreme paralyzing humiliation. She had spent the last 10 years aggressively acting like she was better, richer, and significantly more devout than every single person in this upscale neighborhood. Now she was standing on the hot concrete curb like common trash. Chloe was sitting on top of a hard-shell suitcase, completely ignoring her mother, burying her face deeply in her hands and weeping loudly. The parade of luxury cars continued relentlessly. A black Range Rover driven by the church choir director drove slowly past, completely ignoring Beatrice's frantic, desperate wave for assistance. The explosive news of the bounce donation check and the highly public federal raid on DeAndre had clearly spread like absolute wildfire through the elite social circles. Beatrice and Chloe were officially radioactive. Realizing they had absolutely nowhere to go and no luxury vehicles to drive since the trust officially owned the expensive SUVs parked securely in the garage, Beatrice pulled out her cell phone. I stood comfortably in the cool shade of the grand front porch, watching her scroll frantically through her massive, carefully curated contact list. She dialed a number and held the phone tightly to her ear. I watched her face fall completely flat as the call went straight to voicemail. She dialed another number, then another. She called the wealthy women she had hosted lavish catered brunches for. She called the church board members she had aggressively tried to buy votes from just 2 days ago. She called the elite socialites she had gossiped with for years. Not a single person answered her desperate calls. Her fake transactional friends had completely abandoned her the absolute second her money dried up and her social status evaporated. With her massive credit card limits completely frozen by the federal authorities and her personal checking accounts fully seized by the government, Beatrice had absolutely no options left. She was forced to open a basic ride-sharing app and select the absolute cheapest bare minimum economy option available. 20 agonizing minutes later, a beat-up faded blue compact sedan with a severely cracked windshield and loud squeaking brakes pulled up to the pristine curb. The driver, a young college student wearing a backwards baseball cap and chewing loudly on gum, stepped out and looked at the massive mountain of expensive luggage with complete confusion and utter disdain. "I am definitely not loading all that," the driver said flatly, popping the tiny rusted trunk of the car. "You have to put it in yourself, and whatever does not fit in the back has to stay on the grass. I am not ruining my upholstery for you." Beatrice, the incredibly arrogant woman who used to loudly demand that valet drivers open her doors at five-star downtown restaurants, was forced to physically heave her incredibly heavy bags into the dusty, stained trunk of a cheap economy car. Chloe flatly refused to help her mother, climbing quickly into the back seat and immediately crying loudly about the strange smell of the vehicle. Beatrice struggled, sweating and panting, but she had to leave 3 massive trash bags full of expensive designer clothes sitting directly on the curb because they simply would not fit inside the tiny car. She finally squeezed into the cramped passenger seat, slamming the cheap door shut. The small car struggled noticeably under the massive weight of their luggage, its engine whining loudly as it slowly pulled away from the curb, carrying them away from their fake kingdom forever. I turned my attention away from the street and looked back toward the massive house. Standing quietly in the dark shadow of the grand mahogany front doors was my father, David. He had not stepped outside to help Beatrice carry a single bag. He had not offered to leave the property with her. He had simply stood in the cool entryway, cowardly hiding in the shadows, watching his entire toxic marriage completely disintegrate on the front lawn. The massive security guard stood silently at the edge of the porch, giving us a wide berth, but keeping a highly focused eye on his exact movements. David looked at me, his eyes completely hollow and entirely devoid of the false patriarchal bravado he used to carry so proudly. "Zoe," he said, his voice quiet, trembling and heavily strained. "I want you to know that I am calling my corporate attorney this afternoon. I am officially filing for divorce from Beatrice. She completely destroyed this family. She lied to me constantly. She let DeAndre ruin my pristine credit, and she maliciously tried to steal your inheritance. I am done with her. I am completely, permanently done. He took a slow, highly hesitant step forward, attempting to force a weak, deeply pathetic, and entirely unconvincing smile onto his aging face. I know I made a lot of terrible mistakes in the past, Zoe. I was weak. I was completely blind to what she was actively doing to you all those years. But we can absolutely fix this now. It is just you and me again. The real Washingtons. We can rebuild the corporate business together. I was thinking since Beatrice is finally gone and the house is empty, I could just stay here in the main master bedroom. I can help you manage the massive estate. We can be a real family again. I looked at him feeling absolutely no anger, no sadness, and entirely no pity. My face was a mask of cold, unbreakable, highly calculated stone. He truly believed that simply discarding his toxic wife would magically erase decades of extreme emotional neglect and blatant cowardice. He honestly thought he could just slide seamlessly back into the luxurious comfort of my grandfather's wealth by playing the helpless victim of his own terrible life choices. You do not get to blame Beatrice for your own absolute cowardice, David, I said, my voice sharp cold and completely unwavering. Beatrice did not force you to ignore me when I was crying in my room. She did not force you to sign away my hard-earned business equity to a criminal. You actively chose the path of least resistance every single time you were faced with a difficult decision. You are not a victim here. You are just a weak man who finally ran out of people to hide behind. His weak, hopeful smile completely vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer dawning panic. Zoe, please, he begged, his voice cracking. This is my home. I built my life here. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight? I turned slightly and gestured toward the far end of the sprawling estate, pointing directly at the small two-bedroom structure located hidden behind the massive main swimming pool. You can rent the guest house, I stated, delivering the absolute final non-negotiable terms of his entirely new reality. At current market value. I expect the first and last month's rent paid in full up front by the end of the business day tomorrow. If the funds are not securely deposited in the trust account by 5 o'clock, my security team will physically escort you off the property, exactly like they just did your wife. David stared at me in absolute, horrified, breathless silence. The devastating reality finally crashed down upon him. He finally understood that I was not his obedient, desperate daughter begging for his approval anymore. I was the absolute landlord of his entire existence. I turned my back on him without waiting for a response and walked down the wide brick pathway toward the perimeter of the sprawling estate. The large security guards fell perfectly and silently into step right behind me. I reached the massive towering iron gates that guarded the grand entrance to the property. I grabbed the heavy cold metal bars, pulled the massive gates firmly together, and slid the thick steel locking mechanisms securely into place. The loud, heavy metallic clank echoed sharply and beautifully through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. I was symbolically and literally shutting out the toxicity, permanently securing my boundaries, and finally locking the painful ghosts of my past outside where they truly belonged. 6 months later, the blistering, suffocating summer heat that had served as the dramatic backdrop for my family's spectacular implosion had finally given way to the crisp, clear, and incredibly sharp winds of late autumn. The chaotic dust had completely settled over the city, leaving behind a radically altered reality for everyone involved. The federal justice system moves incredibly slowly for most people, but when you hand a highly ambitious federal prosecutor an airtight, meticulously documented forensic accounting file wrapped with a neat digital bow, the wheels of justice spin with terrifying, breathtaking speed. DeAndre did not even attempt to take his case to trial. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence, forged signatures, and illegal offshore wire transfers, his sleazy public defender aggressively advised him to take a plea deal. He is currently serving a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 to 10 years in a high-security federal penitentiary located 3 states away. He permanently traded his ridiculous maroon velvet blazers and leased diamond watches for a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. His imaginary commercial real estate empire completely evaporated, leaving him with absolutely nothing but massive federal restitution orders and a tremendous amount of time to sit in a tiny concrete cell and think about his extreme arrogance. Chloe experienced a completely different but equally devastating type of imprisonment. With her massive bank accounts entirely frozen and her fraudulent husband locked away, her lucrative, completely fake social media empire instantly collapsed. The luxury brands dropped her sponsorships overnight. The internet, which she had so aggressively tried to weaponize against me, turned on her with absolute ruthless precision. She was forced to completely delete all of her social media profiles to escape the relentless, massive wave of public mockery. Today, Chloe is working a grueling minimum wage retail job at a high-end department store located in the exact same luxury shopping mall where she used to spend thousands of stolen dollars. She spends 8 hours a day on her feet wearing a cheap polyester uniform, silently folding cashmere sweaters, and organizing shoe displays for the exact same wealthy elite women she used to desperately try to impress. Beatrice suffered the absolute worst fate of all, precisely because her entire existence was built exclusively on her perceived public image. The federal grand jury formally indicted her for criminal conspiracy and medical forgery. While she managed to narrowly avoid serving active prison time by completely turning on her corrupt defense attorney and testifying aggressively against him, she was entirely stripped of her wealth, her assets, and her immaculate social standing. She currently lives in an incredibly cramped, highly depressing one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The walls are paper-thin, the plumbing constantly leaks, and the neighborhood is loud and unforgiving. Her massive collection of designer bags and fake Birkins are shoved tightly into a single tiny closet, absolutely useless relics of a dead life. She tried repeatedly to return to Greater Zion Fellowship, but the church elders formally and quietly asked her not to come back. Her reputation in the affluent community was permanently, irreversibly destroyed. She is an absolute ghost haunting a cheap apartment completely isolated from the elite world she sacrificed everything to be a part of. My father David is still living on the sprawling Washington estate exactly as I promised he could. He occupies the small, incredibly modest two-bedroom guest house located behind the main swimming pool. Every single month, on the absolute first day of the month without fail, he submits a certified cashier check for the exact premium market value rent to my private property management company. He spends his days sitting on the small porch, staring quietly at the massive empty brick mansion that he used to own, deeply reflecting on the extreme cowardice that cost him his legacy, his dignity, and his only biological daughter. I did not let the massive trauma of my past slow me down for a single second. I did not take the inherited millions and simply disappear to a tropical island. That is what fake wealth does. True generational wealth builds, expands, and completely dominates. I stepped out of my sleek black executive town car and looked up at the towering state-of-the-art glass skyscraper located in the absolute heart of the downtown financial district. The morning air was sharp and invigorating. I walked through the massive revolving glass doors, completely bypassing the standard security desk, with a brief, highly respected nod to the guards, and stepped into the private executive elevator. I pressed the button for the top floor. When the polished steel doors slid silently open, I did not step into someone else's corporate lobby. I stepped into my own absolute empire. The reception area was a breathtaking, incredibly intimidating masterpiece of modern corporate design. The floors were imported black marble polished to a brilliant mirror-like shine. The walls were paneled with rich, dark mahogany, paying a subtle, deeply respectful tribute to my grandfather's original lumber business. Displayed prominently behind the massive custom-built reception desk were large, brushed steel letters that aggressively commanded the entire room: Washington Elite Forensics. Washington Elite. I was no longer just a senior employee grinding out 80-hour work weeks to save a failing family business. I was the absolute apex predator of the corporate financial world. I had taken the $7 million cashier check and strategically used it as the ultimate seed money to launch my own highly elite, completely independent forensic accounting firm. I aggressively poached the absolute best investigative talent from the top 4 global accounting agencies. My firm now exclusively handles massive multi-million-dollar corporate audits, high-stakes federal fraud investigations, and incredibly complex offshore asset recoveries. We are ruthless, we are brilliantly effective, and we are completely untouchable. Good morning, Miss Washington, my executive assistant said, standing up respectfully as I walked past the reception desk. The initial financial reports for the international merger are sitting on your desk, and your senior legal team is ready for the 10 o'clock briefing. Thank you, Sarah, I replied, my voice calm, steady, and filled with absolute unwavering authority. I walked down the wide, brightly lit hallway, passing rows of sleek glass-walled offices, where my highly paid, incredibly brilliant team of accountants and federal investigators were already hard at work. There was no toxic family drama here. There was no gaslighting, no manipulation, and absolutely no fake posturing. There was only pure, unadulterated competence and absolute professional respect. I reached the end of the hallway and placed my hand firmly on the polished silver handle of the massive, heavy double oak doors, leading directly into the chief executive suite. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the massive, sun-drenched corner office. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire sprawling city skyline. Sitting comfortably in a plush, incredibly expensive leather armchair positioned perfectly by the massive window was Grandma Loretta. She looked absolutely magnificent. The incredibly heavy, oppressive burden of pretending to be a frail, incompetent woman trapped in a depressing nursing facility had completely vanished from her shoulders. She was wearing a beautifully tailored cream-colored cashmere sweater, her silver hair styled flawlessly, her posture perfectly straight and proud. She looked 20 years younger, radiating incredible health, sharp intelligence, and profound peace. She was holding a delicate porcelain cup, gently sipping her warm herbal tea as she looked out over the massive city that her late husband had helped build from the ground up. She turned her head slightly as I closed the heavy oak doors behind me. Her sharp, brilliant eyes locked onto mine, and a slow, deeply knowing, incredibly proud smile spread across her face. "You are entirely early today, Zoe," she said, her raspy voice filled with profound warmth and absolute satisfaction. "I have an empire to run, Grandma," I replied, walking across the plush carpet and taking a seat in the matching leather armchair directly across from her. I set my designer tote bag down and leaned back, exhaling a long, incredibly peaceful breath. We sat there together in the beautiful, completely unbreakable silence. We did not need to talk about Beatrice or Chloe or DeAndre or David. They were completely irrelevant footnotes in our massive unfolding history. They had desperately tried to bury us, completely unaware that we were the actual seeds of the Washington legacy. I stood up slowly from my chair and walked directly up to the massive glass window. I placed my hand gently against the cool pane, looking far down at the bustling tiny cars and the thousands of people rushing frantically to their jobs below. The city looked incredibly small from up here. I looked over my shoulder at my grandmother, who was watching me with absolute, unwavering pride. True generational wealth is absolutely never about the luxury cars you lease, the massive houses you blindly mortgage, or the fake designer clothes you wear to impress people who secretly hate you. I said, my voice echoing with profound, unshakable truth in the massive executive office. It is never about tearing other people down just to make yourself feel incredibly tall. Loretta nodded slowly, taking another calm sip of her tea. "What is it about then?" she asked, fully knowing the answer, but deeply wanting to hear me say it out loud. I turned my attention back to the massive, sprawling skyline, feeling the incredible, limitless power of my own absolute independence surging through my veins. "It is about raw, undeniable competence," I said quietly but firmly. "It is about absolute financial independence. It is about deeply knowing your own inherent worth and having the ultimate courage to brutally sever ties with anyone who aggressively tries to devalue you, even if they share your blood. They completely underestimated what I was capable of because they only understood the hollow illusion of power. They did not understand that the ultimate, most devastating revenge against toxic people is never violence, and it is never screaming matches in a crowded room. I smiled a cold, brilliant, entirely victorious smile. The ultimate revenge is massive, absolute, completely unbothered success. True generational wealth is not about wearing expensive designer clothes or living in a massive mortgaged mansion to impress strangers. It is about quiet competence, fierce independence, and deeply knowing your own inherent worth. When toxic people try to tear you down, do not engage in their loud drama. Simply let their own greed become their ultimate downfall. The absolute best revenge will always be your massive, unbreakable, and unbothered success.